Mud and reeds, heat and gnats, flat as a griddle from horizon to horizon. That is the stage where cities turn from rumor into architecture. Southern Mesopotamia delivers no stone, almost no trees, barely a hill. It offers only clay, water that floods when it feels like it, and a sun that behaves like an interrogator's lamp. Out of that minimalist toolkit, the first urban civilization rises, not out of noble mountains or marble quarries, but out of marsh and mud brick. The audacity is the point. Archaeologists love to start farther back because the prequel holds the keys. In the Ubaid period, roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BC, small villages knit together across the alluvial plain. Places like Eridu, Tel Abu Sharain, grow from a modest mound into a religious high-rise, rebuilt temple upon temple, 17 times, according to excavators. The priests keep rebuilding the same sacred platform because the gods allegedly prefer the address. People craft long houses with tripartite plans, fish the marshes, herd cattle, and plant fields pumped full of irrigation water. Irrigation in this world is not a casual project. It means canals cut by hand, levees that must hold, and water managers whose bad week equals crop failure. As Robert McCormick Adams documented in his field surveys, the alluvial plain becomes a landscape engineered by human stubbornness, canals as arteries, fields as organized lungs. By around 4,000 Bath, a switch flips. This becomes the work period, and the map starts blinking with city lights. Uruk, modern Walker, surges. Its Iana precinct develops into a monumental complex of temples, courtyards, and storerooms that screams organization. The white temple towers on the Anu platform, a gleaming plastered ziggurat ancestor that announces power, even when the bricks are just mud-dried under the relentless sun. The Walker vase, carved around 3,200 to 3,000 Bes, and found in that precinct, depicts a parade of offerings to Inanna, grain, flocks, and people carrying the good stuff. No one does subtle. The message says, abundant production plus ritual equals social order. Scale proves the real flex. Uruk sprawls to something like 250 to 400 hectares, depending on the phase and the scholar, with a population estimate floating from 40,000 toward possibly 80,000 at peak. City walls stretch like a belt around it. Later tradition has Gilgamesh credited with those walls. Archaeology finds at least evidence of massive fortifications, even if the epic's brag gets generous. Unlike later Mediterranean cities that use stone, Uruk stacks millions of sun-dried bricks. Bricks are the Sumerian wildcard. Mud plus straw plus sunlight equals everything. Walls, temples, benches, kilns. Clay also makes the document that keeps the entire experiment from collapsing. The invention that cheats oblivion here is writing. Not for poetry, not at first. Around 3,300 to 3,200 BC, proto-cuneiform tablets start appearing, especially in Uruk-Ive layers. These are not love letters. They are lists, barley rations, sheep counts, beer allotments, names paired with numbers. It looks like the earliest Excel spreadsheet, except the spreadsheets survive, because clay does not need a charger. J. Ne. Postgate. Hans Nissen, Peter Demeraux, and Robert England have all spelled out the administrative nature of these earliest texts. Writing transforms from tokens and sealed clay envelopes, bulle, into impressions of a wedge-shaped stylus onto flat tablets. Cuneiform is born by pressing a reed cut at an angle, making triangular wedges. The script begins as pictures and ends up as a complex system that can record Sumerian, Akkadian, and anything else bold enough to ride those wedges. The math behind this world is sexagesimal, base 60. It seems arbitrary until the modern clock and the 360-degree circle are remembered. That ticking second hand owes a debt to reed styluses and grain accounts. The Sumerian numeric system includes multiple bases for different goods, a bureaucratic fever dream that nonetheless polices the flow of bread and beer. Those bevel rim bowls, mass-produced by the tens of thousands, likely serve as ration containers. Factory lunch boxes in clay. Archaeologists pull them out of kilns by the bucket load because a city of 50,000 people needs to feed its laborers, and the bowls reveal the scale of rationing. A typical laborer in later earthly records receives rations measured in silla, a unit around the size of a litre. Doses vary, but 2 to 3 silla of barley per day appear frequently. Beer rations sit right there too, because the brew is liquid bread and slightly safer than river water. Temples dominate early. The Anna complex in Uruk becomes a cult and accounting machine. Temples own fields, herds, workshops, boats, and lists. Priests oversee flows of barley and fish, as if SIFO were a holy title. Cylinder seals stamp identities on clay, the signatures of the time. A seal rolled across wet clay leaves, intricate scenes of heroes grappling lions or banquet attendees lifting cups, plus a name. In a world without plastic ID, a cylinder seal becomes the credit card, passport, and personal brand. The artistry is next level. Tiny scenes cut with precision on stone imported from far away. Often lapis lazuli from Afghanistan's Badakhshan or chlorite and serpentine carved to advertise authority. The seals also unlock global connections. Southern Mesopotamia lacks every glamorous resource. No copper in the ground, no timber tall enough to build monumental roofs, no hard stone. The Sumerians compensate with trade, like their lives depend on it, because they do. By 3500 to 3000 B, Uruk gear appears far beyond the home turf. Habuba Kabira south and Jabal Araduda on the Euphrates in modern Syria show Uruk-style temples, houses, and admin gear planted like franchises. Guillermo Algaze called it the Uruk world system. Networks radiating out to tap metals and timber from Anatolia, bitumen from near Hit on the Euphrates, diorite and chlorite from Oman and Iran, lapis from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus realm. An Uruk-style colony at Habuba Kabira is fully planned, walled, and gone within a couple of centuries. A pop-up supply chain node. Meanwhile, the home cities scale up intensely. Robert Adams maps out canal lines that look like spiderwebs, connecting settlements like beads on threads of water. This scale carries a cost. Irrigation wins harvests, but brings salt. Water evaporates in the blasting Mesopotamian heat. Salt stays, and the soil turns cranky. Archaeobotanical evidence shows a shift from wheat, which hates salt, to barley, which tolerates it. By the mid-3rd millennium BOSS, barley dominates. Wheat recedes. The environmental bill arrives early. Worse still, the rivers can flood unpredictably. The Nile is a moody but mostly regular clock. The Tigris behaves like a cat. The worldview that grows in this soil is pragmatic to the point of cosmic cynicism. The gods are powerful and capricious. Humans are here to keep the irrigation ditches clean and the temples stocked. Later myths reflect this, from the flood narrative of Ziusudra to the grumpy gods of Atrahasis. Those texts survive on later tablets, but the mindset feels very Uruk. The next phase, labeled Jemdet Nas, around 3100 to 2900 BC, is short and gorgeous. Painted jars with geometric designs, more administrative texts, a bloom of cities. Then, the early dynastic period begins around 2900 B. and runs until about 2350 B. This is the drama-rich era of rival city-states. Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Nippur, Shuruppak, Adab, and more that end with -a and -ash like a playlist. Each city develops its own patron god and institutional identity. Enlil at Nippur holds cosmic lordship. Inanna rules passion and power at Uruk. Enki runs watery wisdom out of Eridu. Nana, the moon god, watches The politics fit the architecture. Stacked, layered, and a little unstable. The city priest, the Ensi, manages temple lands. The king, the Lugal, claims military leadership and wider authority. Sometimes they seem to be the same person, sometimes not. Inscriptions and later, king lists talk of hegemony rather than empire. Rulers take the title King of Kish to signal regional superiority even when they live elsewhere. Kish sits closer to the north and the trade routes, and the title grants bragging rights. The Sumerian king list, a document compiled centuries later and mixing myth with fact like a chaotic family tree, claims that kingship descends from heaven, moves from city to city, and stretches across impossible ages, measured in tens of thousands of years for early kings. Then it pivots and slots known rulers into a plausible order. Historians treat it like a flawed witness that still saw parts of the crime. Out of the fog-steppe kings with receipts. In Artem of Lagash, around 2450 Bath, by the middle chronology, carves his victory over neighbouring Umma into stone. The stele of the vultures shows a phalanx of spear-carrying soldiers in locked ranks. A drill sergeant fantasy on limestone. Cores lie in a heap, while vultures carry severed heads. No metaphor needed. The conflict revolves around farmland called the Gawedan Plain and water rights. Mesalim of Kish had earlier arbitrated the boundary and set up a stele to mark it, complete with a curse for anyone who moved it. The curse fails to stop Umma. War flares. Unatim wins. The inscription lists canal, digging as aggressively as it lists skull cracking. Power equals the means to move water and the muscle to keep enemies off the levees. The earliest statecraft here is a blend of sacred, military, and infrastructural. Temples remain. Huge landowners. Palaces start to look like rival corporations. Nippur becomes a politically neutral religious capital, the Vatican of the Sumerian world, where kings go to seek the blessing of Enlil, because holding his favor makes a claim to supremacy look convincing. The city that holds Nippur does not necessarily rule everyone, but a king who rebuilds its temple earns a cosmic thumbs up. This yields an entire genre of inscriptions, essentially reading that King so-and-so, rebuilt the temple of Enlil with piety and stylish bricks. Piety is public relations with bricks. Meanwhile, the southern economy goes into high gear. Tablets from Farah, Shuruppak, and Lagash record worker rosters with job titles that sound familiar in a 21st century office, just with more goats. There are brewers, bakers, weavers, metalworkers, smelters, reed workers, boatmen, and scribes who track them all. Women show up in the records noticeably in the weaving sector, which likely employs thousands. The temple households run enormous textile operations, turning the South's best asset, wool, into exports. The Akkadian words for fine textile types start to appear. Silver enters as a money of account, measured in shekels, minas, and talents by weight rather than coin. Barter remains a vibe, but conversion rates put practical numbers on the economy. A shekel floats around, 8 grams of silver in later standards. Exact third millennium standards vary by time and place. Contracts, loans, and receipts exist on clay, with witnesses, seals, and curses for anyone who tries to cheat the terms. The legal muscle is real even without a modern police force. Military technology evolves with its own swagger. The standard of dated around 2600 B from the royal tombs, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, displays a war side and a peace side in shimmering mosaics of shell, lapis lazuli, and red limestone laid in bitumen. On the war side, chariots, really heavy, solid-wheeled carts, roll over enemies, pulled by onagers, wild asses that look cute until harnessed to logistics. Infantry march with spears and shields. A general stands taller and more elaborately dressed. On the peace side, that same elite shares a banquet while musicians play, including a lyre with a bull's head. The lyre shows up in the royal tombs themselves, and those tombs deliver a gut punch to modern sensibilities. In the grave of Puobi, her cylinder seal names her by that form, and she likely holds queenly status. Woolley recorded 52 attendants, laid down to accompany her. There are more in other tombs, often with cups near their mouths, skulls intact and neatly arranged. The scene implies ceremonial death to follow a ruler, whether this is willing sacrifice or forced. The elegance of the golden headdresses, gold and lapis jewelry, and that bull-headed lyre sharpens the contrast. The wealth in those tombs is literally global. Lapis from Afghanistan, carnelian likely from the Indus Valley, gold from perhaps Anatolia or Iran, and bitumen binding everything from local sources. A city that can pull stone from 2,000 kilometers away can also decide the fate of dozens of attendants. With a nod, civilization and cruelty hold hands. Myths swirl around kings and cities in this era. The city of Uruk claims a hero king named Gilgamesh, fifth on the king list for that city. Later Sumerian poems and the Babylonian epic shape him into a complex figure, part builder, part tyrant, part seeker of immortality. The earliest Sumerian Gilgamesh stories date to around the Ur-30 period, roughly 2100 Bash, but they reflect older legends. The standard Babylonian version that modern readers know lands much later, around the second millennium. The large idea stays constant. Cities grant glory and sadness, achievements and losses, and ants like humans carry them all. Even the epic ends with a tour of the walls, not a conquest. Walls matter here, because walls hold water and enemies at bay. The explosive growth of the Uruk period left footprints far beyond Sumer, and the early dynastic world continues to trade widely. Dilmun, probably around modern Bahrain, serves as an entrepot. Magan, likely Oman, supplies copper. Melahar, a name that points to the Indus Valley civilization, appears in later 3rd millennium texts as a source for exotic woods, animals, and carnelian beads. Indus seals surface in Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamian cylinder seals copy Indus animal iconography. Sumerian boatmen splash down the rivers to the Gulf in reed boats coated with bitumen and sail or pole along river canals that look like parallelograms on satellite photos. Their ships carry wool, textiles, and barley out and bring back metal, stone, and luxury goods that feed elite identity. In the middle of this, the language map is bilingual. Sumerian dominates in the south. Akkadian, a Semitic language, spreads in the north and mixes into the south early. Personal names in Akkadian show up in early dynastic texts, and kings of Kish with Akkadian names appear, like Emeber-Jasi, whose fragments have been found at Carthage. No one would be comfortable with modern ethnic categories. People flow with trade routes and urban economies. Languages blend in households and marketplaces. Later empires formalize a switch. But even early on, scribes flex between tongues. Education in the scribal hejuba, the tablet house, trains memory like a CrossFit session. Students copy lexical lists that look like indexes of everything. Fish, birds, gods, professional titles, even rare words, just to keep the system limber. The goal seems to be mastery of categories, because a society that records everything needs scribes who can categorize anything. Around the mid-3rd millennium, a new type of monarch appears on the inscriptions. The conqueror who wants more than local bragging rights. Lugalzajazi of Umma, around 2350 Bas, claims to have subdued all the city-states of Sumer and to have extended his rule to the sea. He grabs the title King of Sumer and Akkad as a flex. For a moment, he looks like the new boss. Then, a man from Akkad steps onto the stage and rearranges the furniture. Sargon of Akkad, reigning roughly 2334 to 2279 by the Middle Chronology, builds what historians often call the First Empire in the sense of sustained, far-flung rule. His birth story in later texts reads like a foundling myth. Set adrift in a basket, rescued, raised to become king. It is excellent. Pry, even if it is legend. The facts are hard enough. He defeats a Lugalzajace, parades him in a collar through Nippur, and installs Akkadian governors across the cities. He builds a new capital, Akkad, Agadi in Akkadian. Location still unexcavated, likely under tumbled riverbeds north of Babylon, and takes titles to match his reach. His successors include his famous grandson Naram Sin, who reigns around 2254 to 2218 Bes, and declares himself divine, carving his horned helmet into the victory stele that shows him striding over mountains and enemies like a demigod. That horned crown marks godhood in Mesopotamian iconography, and its appearance above a human forehead is a power move that does not whisper. The Akkadian Empire does not erase Sumerian culture. The languages cohabit. The bureaucratic machine continues to hum. The writing adapts to Akkadian as smoothly as it handled Sumerian. The empire expands north toward the upper Euphrates, east into Elam, and west toward the Levant, riding the same network Uruk built but with military teeth bared. As Mark van der Merriop notes, empires live by controlling nodes, cities, routes, sources of copper, timber, and stone. Akkad does it better because it stands on the backs of city-states that already built canals and warehouses. The difference is centralization and military logistics. Then the empire frays. Around 2200 BC, a sharp climate event hits the Near East, the so-called 4.2 kiloyear event. Pollen cores, lake sediments, and layers of wind-blown dust from sites like Tel Lilan suggest increased aridity and dust storms. The northern plains lose harvests. Urban centers shrink. Akkad faces rebellions, external pressure, and eventually collapses under the combined weight of internal revolts and attacks by groups the texts call Gutians, coming from the Zagros. The Gutian interlude is remembered in Sumerian texts as a time of chaos, shepherds unskilled in kingship, cities going quiet. The bitterness of the memory might be exaggeration, but the downturn across multiple lines of evidence looks real. Sumer is not done. The Ur-3 dynasty rises around 2112 B under Ur-Num, who founds a new centralization, often called the Sumerian Renaissance. He and his son Shulgi, who rules about 2094 to 2047 B, make the bureaucracy sing like a choir. The ziggurat at Ur still stands in colossal meat on the landscape. Layers built by Ur-Nammu and finished by Shulgi around 2100 B. Its massive platforms support a temple to Nana, the moon god, with staircases that look like they could handle monarchs, priests, and an entire festival in one climb. The administration becomes painfully efficient. Tens of thousands of tablets record flocks, rations, labor, and projects. Shulgi boasts of running from Nippur to in a single day, during a ritual circuit, a kingly marathon inscribed in bronze. This era leaves the earliest surviving law code text, the Code of Namu, dated around 2100 to 2050 BERS, in copies from later centuries. It predates the more famous Code of Hammurabi by a few hundred years. The code gives a sense of proportional justice that differs from lex talionis. Many offences are punished by fines measured in silver. If a man knocks out another man's tooth, he pays a fine. If a wife commits adultery, the penalties escalate. If a man commits murder, the death penalty appears. The tone is administrative, not philosophical. The text wants a functioning society more than it wants to argue about justice in the abstract. It lists weights and measures in terms of silver, barley, and labor. The command economy organizes everything from brick quotas to shepherd routes. Scholars like Piotr Steinkeller have shown how the state uses rations, work teams, and road stations to standardize the movement of goods and people across the alluvial plain. The Ur-3 state steps hard on infrastructure. It builds a large fortification between the rivers mentioned in year names under Shu Sin, Shulgi's successor, called the Wall against the Amorites. The line extends for scores of kilometers and acts less like a great wall and more like a dike canal boundary that channels and controls movement. The Pry reads defensive. The archaeology suggests economic as much as military function. Things are never simply one or the other when barley and bricks are the weapons. In the galleries of Ur-3, culture thrums. In Hiduonna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, but crafted as a Sumerian high priestess of Nana at leaves hymns to Inanna and to temples across the land. She writes in the earlier Akkadian period around the 23rd century Bas, but her texts live on in the scribal tradition into the Ur-3 world and beyond. She is often called the earliest named author in human history because the tablets state her name and title. Whether she personally wrote every line is debated. The fact that a literary persona appears this early is astonishing. The hymns breathe political theology. Inanna both terrifies and protects. The cities owe allegiance through ritual and offerings. Votive statues of Gadir of Lagash, a ruler in the late 22nd century Bash, just before Ur-3 peaks, sit in museums with calm eyes and clasped hands. Gudea commissions diorite statues heavy enough to last forever, inscribed with building dedications to Ningirsu. He lists stones brought from Magan, wood from the mountains, and copper from afar. His statues look serene because their texts brag for them. The rise of the city-states hinges on solving the same problems repeatedly. Power equals control over water, labor, and long-distance connections. The Sumerians systematized these. Their city-states look very modern in structure. Core, periphery, specialized tasks, managers, auditors. The Aduba trains scribes to write multiple numeric systems. The admin system deploys standardized containers and measures. The temple and palace act like multinational firms, exporting finished goods and importing raw materials. Even their spirituality functions like an economy. Gods receive rations, festivals run on time, and generations of rebuildings tie the legitimacy of rulers to the maintenance of the cosmic house. The myth of universal Sumerian invention requires a debunking. They did not invent agriculture itself. Farming appears across the Fertile Crescent thousands of years earlier. They probably did not invent the wheel first. The oldest known wooden wheel so far was found in Slovenia's Ljubljansko barge, dated around 3,350 to 3,100 B. They do not, contrary to some memes, invent money in coin form. Coinage waits for Lydia in the first millennium BES. What they absolutely do is industrialize writing and urban administration. They refine the wheel, combining it with the solid axle and making it the partner of the war cart and wagon. They embed base 60 math into time and geometry in a way that refuses to die. They give law a written backbone. They treat beer as a staple in a way that modern craft breweries can only envy. Samuel Noah Kramer's evergreen book title, History Begins at Sumer, uses a catchy exaggeration. The deeper truth is that urban history finds its first permanent footing in their mud. City life breathes in details. A worker's ration tablet from Uma in the Earth 3 period lists allocations to men and women, adults and children, based on rank and duty. The numbers vary but paint a system balancing calories against labor demands, like a spreadsheet running in clay. Schools require discipline. A Sumerian exercise tablet displays a student's clumsy sign practice, then a scribe's neat correction. The tablet often shows the teacher's cane as part of the text, the ancient equivalent of a red pen with physical consequences. Temples house archives, but also kitchens, breweries, and storerooms. A single temple might command tens of thousands of hectares of field. Barley flows in at harvest, recorded in gur, with one gur something like 300 litres, though units vary and standardization is an ongoing struggle. Outgoing shipments list fish, dates and wool, each with its own numeric system. The scribes manage conversion tables like wizards because the entire economy sits on their accuracy. Religious imagery shifts the mood from dull admin to electric art. The Walker head, a marble female face found in Uruk, date around 3,200 to 3,000 B, looks past visitors with blank eyes. It likely once had inlaid eyes and eyebrows, a wig or headdress, and served as a cult statue head perhaps of Inanna. The skin is polished. The eyes, now empty, would have been luminous. The eyes on votive statues from the Temple of Abu at Tel Asmar stare with supernatural intensity. Early dynastic hands clasped in prayer, pupils like saucers. The effect is hypnotic. The artists either think the gods are always watching or want to make sure the gods notice they are watching. Either way, the gaze of Sumer is fully caffeinated. Urban planning develops a template. Cities have sacred precincts with platform temples and courtyards, administrative quarters with long rooms for storing jars and tablets, residential neighborhoods with narrow lanes, and outer belts of gardens and fields woven into canals that feed them. Gates function as choke points, offices, and ritual spaces. City walls create political borders and mental ones, separating urban identity from rural reach. The river acts as the highway. Traffic is constant. The scent of bitumen hangs in the air, where boats get sealed. Kilns bake bricks in jars, filling the sky with smoke. Sunlight registers on the white plaster of temple facades like a physical force. Into that brightness steps law and literature. The Code of Ur-Nammu lays down fines in silver, like a price list of misbehavior. Later codes, like that of Lipit Ishtar around 1930 Bas and Hammurabi around 1754 Bas, grow from the same soil. The shift over time from compensation to more talionic justice says more about state power and its theatrics than about an innate sense of fairness. In the earlier code, paying fines binds people to the system and keeps the economy running. Later, public punishments assert royal power. Poetry in this world walks the same streets as contracts. Enid honors hymns to Inanna burn with a kind of divine intensity that feels both spiritual and political. Inanna destroys mountains that insult her. She rescues kings who honor her. Temples across Sumer receive hymn cycles that gather the landscape into a catalogue of divine addresses. The love song tradition between Inanna and Dumuzi paints a sensual ritual of marriage that likely plays out in festivals that everyone attends. Whether a sacred marriage between king and priestess actually occurs physically or symbolically remains debated. The inscriptions remain decorous, even when the hymns get spicy. Either way, the city watches and eats dates and flatbread, then sleeps, well knowing the cosmic bond is renewed. Back in the real economy, the Sumerian textiles dominate export lists. The wool comes from local herds. The dyes and finishing methods get coded into specialized vocabulary. The scale is industrial. At Earthry, some cities run weaving shops with hundreds of workers. Women occupy the majority of these teams, supervised by managers, with rations allocated by status. The excavated tablets list names and quotas with pitiless specificity. Children show up on the rolls with smaller rations. This is not exploitation free of nuance. The same system also provides minimums and standards that stabilize an otherwise precarious life. Yet, the sheer weight of the administrative detail can make the system feel impersonal. The clay record does not record joy. It records compliance. The ultimate fragility of this civilization hides in the same clay. Mud brick melts when flood or neglect hits. Salinization creeps. Canals silt. The energy needed to keep water lines open is continuous. A few seasons of crisis throws everything out of tune. The fall of Earth-3 around 2004 arrives through a combination of Elamite attack from the east, internal stress, and the encroachment of Amorite groups from the west. Year names record panic and response. Texts of lamentation in Sumerian, the lament for and others, wail in a voice that feels contemporary. Their cities are personified as mothers crying for lost children. The gods abandon their temples. The city gates open to invaders. The laments are crisp because they catalogue reality while speaking myth. Leonard Woolley's excavation at shows real burned layers and hurried burials alongside royal glamour. The story that begins in mud, climbs to ziggurats, and writes itself in wedges always risks ending in dust, then repeats on the next platform with new bricks. Myth-busting always helps modern brains digest this. The Sumerians are not monolithic. They are many city-states that argue, trade, intermarry, and occasionally slaughter each other over water. They do not worship in gloom all day. Their festivals last days with beer that would fell a modern barfly. The so-called gloomy Mesopotamian worldview comes with a vibrant music scene, a thriving artisan class, and a knack for turning everyday needs into ritual beauty. The bull-headed lyres from glitter because someone decided funeral music should look like a gold bull. The temple kitchens cook mountains of bread and brew cauldrons of beer because gods do not eat, but priests and the poor do. Their libraries are desiccated wet clay that becomes eternal when fired accidentally in a disaster. A trick of preservation that makes conflagration into the archivist's friend. The legacy remains. Time measured in 60 splits ticks on. Angles slice into 360 degrees. And the habit of writing down a promise on a durable medium stays. Cities with bureaucracies, law codes that make penalties predictable, taxation by weight and measure, and leaders who understand the peer value of building a big shiny thing in the town centre, all owe something to Sumer. The pattern repeats. A city anchors its legitimacy by a temple, builds walls to hold and to tell, manages water as a weapon and a lifeline, and invents or polishes the tools needed to keep track of its own complexity. Writing finishes the job. Without writing, the Sumerian world looks like a stately pile of mud bricks. With writing, it becomes a conversation across 5,000 years. A few specific exhibits drive it home. The seal impression strips from Uruk, with rows of tiny scenes, capture identity and transaction like a brand gallery. The Inventor cone from Girsu, dated around 2400 B, records the conflicts between Lagash and Umma and a treaty in wedge-shaped curses. The Jemdet Nasser tablets are short and sweet, pure admin poetry. The Sataku text from Ur-3 are accounts of offerings to gods that read like a religious spreadsheet. The statue of Gudea holding a plan of a temple on his lap is literal architecture as power. The early copper helmets of the early dynastic period look more like bowls on heads, but they intimidate because everyone knows the soldier with the shinier bowl belongs to someone important. The beveled rim bowl, which looks like disposable tableware in museums, holds an entire social system in its standardized clay. Authority comes from those excavations. Leonard Woolley, with his wool hats and knack for staging publicity, digs at from 1922 to 1934, recording stratigraphy with care and occasionally theatrical flair. The Diyala excavations at Kafaja, Tel Asmar, and Eshnona under the Chicago Oriental Institute deliver temples, statues, and admin buildings that illustrate early dynastic urban design better than anywhere. Robert Adams and colleagues walk the landscape in the mid-20th century, mapping ancient canals and settlement mounds with a determination that converts field data into historical maps. Nissen, Damerow, and England pull apart the earliest writing to show that the origin of writing is not poetry's need, but accounting's boredom. Guillermo Algaiz publishes the Uruk world system and gives scholars a vocabulary for the long-distance tentacles of southern Mesopotamia. Mark van der Meeroop's synthetic histories pull these threads into a pattern that modern readers can follow without drowning in shards. One last note for the modern myth machine: the famous old Babylonian letter of complaint to Ea-Nasir about bad copper, written around 1750 BOS and found in is a later echo in the same theatre. It is not Sumerian in language. It is Akkadian and a few centuries after Ur-3. It nonetheless demonstrates a straight line from Uruk Ivration tablets to the tone of a customer furiously telling a merchant that the ingots delivered were substandard and the servants abused. That tablet went viral on the internet because its anger feels like a Yelp review. The continuity from Sumer to that rant shows a simple fact: people in cities want accountability, and they write it down when cheated. The rise of the Sumerian city-states does not read like a sweet origin myth. It reads like a grind. Ditches dug, bricks dried, tablets written, gods fed, kings praised, borders disputed, treaties broken, temples rebuilt. That grind builds capacity. That capacity builds monuments and markets. The tension between temple and palace spurs innovation. The balance between local pride and regional hegemony keeps the landscape lively. The collapse and Renaissance pattern repeat because the structures are both robust and fragile at the same time. Robust enough to push against drought and invaders for centuries. Fragile enough to fail if water lines break and leadership falters. A single image sums the whole drama with appropriate ancient swagger. A pilgrimage to Nippur by a king wearing a beard carefully oiled, carrying heavy baskets on a construction site for a temple, recorded in a hymn as an act of piety that proves worthiness. The king does not actually have to haul the bricks. The brag works either way. In Sumer, legitimacy comes in baked bricks and baked clay. People who master clay master memory. That is the real rise, more durable than a wall and more influential than a crown. The wedge strokes bite into wet clay, and 5 millennia later, the lines still read, "A city could fall. A tablet can last fire and flood by accident." The world that says put it in writing lives on, because that habit works. Even the gods would have to nod. Anu perched above Uruk's white temple, Enlil in Nippur's Eka, Enki down in watery Eridu, Inanna fierce at Iana, Nana Ziggurat stepping up at Ur, Ningirsu protecting Lagash. Their houses prove devotion with bricks and beams. Their economies count offerings with decimals that are actually sexagesimals. Ritual calendars coordinate sowing and harvest. Crying in lamentations commemorates disaster with literary beauty that would make a modern poet jealous. This is the urban soul that grows in a place with not a single mountain to carve. A civilization that builds itself out of clay in a floodplain writes its own permanence onto that same clay with a stylus cut from a reed. It is proof that ingenuity can rank higher than geography. The first true cities stand on that insight. The delta proves itself, a classroom, and a crucible. There is a sly punchline in the very medium. Clay tablets are heavy and cheap. They break easily but survive in pieces forever. Filing systems crumbled when palaces burned, and archives cemented into fired brick. Later farmers digging for fill or looters digging for treasure pulled out these brittle chunks and shrugged. They saw stones. The things spoke only to those who knew wedges. Then, in the 19th century, scholars taught themselves to read cuneiform again. German and British and French and Iraqi experts laying eyes on lines that once just counted sheep. In 1872, George Smith read the flood from one of these and reportedly undressed in his excitement, a detail too good to check and too human not to enjoy. That moment pulled Sumer into the modern imagination. But the story was already there. The Sumerians had already told it, written it, filed it, and stamped it with seals that carry more bravado than most modern logos. The rise of the Sumerian city-states is not an origin myth pinned to one genius or one event. It is a system pressed into shape by environmental necessity, social competition, and religious ambition, and then kept in memory by clay. Eridu stacks temples like geological layers. Uruk invents bureaucracy and scale. Lagash and Umma fight in formations under a murderous sun and carve their grievances into stone. Kish flexes a title. Nippur hands out divine legitimacy. Like a cosmic notary, Akkad centralizes. Earth 30 standardizes. The entire plane learns to think like a city. It never stops being dramatic. It never stops being practical. It never stops being human. The cities rise, not because the land gifts them riches, but because people decide guidelines, measurements and rituals can make a swamp work like a nation. That decision writes itself into world history and never fully fades. The most feared soldiers in Greece once got run down by men in linen armor, carrying javelins. That scene plays out in 390 Bus, near Lechaeum, when Athenian commander Iphicrates uses peltasts to shred a Spartan Mora of heavy infantry. Xenophon, a cheerleader for Sparta, describes it in Hellenica and still cannot spin it as anything but a mess. Men trained to stand shoulder to shoulder got picked apart by skirmishers and never caught them. The Spartan mystique took an arrow to the heel that day, and it never quite stopped bleeding. The image everyone knows comes with bronze muscles, perfect red cloaks, and a phalanx stomping to flute music. The truth lands harder. Spartan dominance grew out of fear of an enslaved majority, fine-tuned discipline, and a willingness to live like permanent conscripts in a state-sized boot camp. That machine evolves over centuries. It peaks, adapts, refuses to adapt, and finally breaks. Along the way, the training gets mythologized and the tactics get copied, hacked, and finally bypassed by new tech, new formations, and someone else's better idea. The seed gets planted in the 8th and 7th centuries by. Sparta is not born ultra-military. It becomes ultra-military. Early Sparta is just one Dorian city among many in the Eurotas Valley, with 4 villages merging into a polis and a 5th, Amyclae, folded in later. Tradition paints a lawgiver, Kyrgyz, as the architect of everything, dropping the great retro like stone tablets from a mountain. Modern historians treat that as origin myth with useful truth embedded. Plutarch, writing in the 2nd century CE, credits Lycurgus with the agoge, communal messes, equal land allotments, and a ban on silver and gold coinage. Some of that existed, some of it evolved, and some of it reads like a moral fable for Romans who wanted Greek austerity without giving up their villas. The real turning point sits on the western side of Mount Taygetus, the conquest of Messenia in 2 waves, roughly c. 740 and 2 and 2. 660-650 BC creates a helot underclass that outnumbers the citizen body by a terrifying ratio. Tatius, the Spartan war poet of the mid-7th century, writes elegies calling for courage and unity in what he treats as a long, hard war. Helots as state-owned serfs, tied to Spartan land allotments. Periokoi, the dwellers around, are free but politically subordinate communities, handling trade and crafts, and they fight as hoplites for Sparta. That social pyramid fuels the army and explains the paranoia. Every campaign and every reform is haunted by the possibility of revolt behind the lines. Sparta's early hoplite reforms do not invent the phalanx, but they become the phalanx's most disciplined evangelists. The aspis, the heavy round shield of about 90 centimeters in diameter, weighing around 7-8 kilograms, enters the game across the Peloponnese during the 7th century. The dory spear lengthens to about 2.7 meters. The armor shifts over time from bronze bell cuirasses to lighter composite armor, like the linothorax. Argos, Corinth, Athens, and a dozen other cities are part of this arms race. Sparta's contribution is psychological and procedural. Their trick is to make formation behavior a second nervous system. The rest of Greece builds a hoplite phalanx on habit and citizen pride. Sparta builds one on institutional obsession. The agoge becomes the factory floor. Boys enter public upbringing around age 7. They are split into age cohorts with formal ranks: paids, paidiskoi, and hebontes. Each step means tighter discipline, harder training, and more responsibility. Literacy exists, but not as a priority. Music and choral dance serve as drill for coordination, timing, and unity. Stealing is not only allowed, but encouraged if it trains cunning and stealth. Punishment comes for getting caught, not for taking the food. That detail shows up in Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, and while Plutarch writes centuries later, the practice lines up with a state that treats teenagers like force recon interns. The famous night-stalking Crypteia appears in sources as a kind of secret police/scout training. Plutarch describes it as young Spartans roaming the countryside with daggers to terrorize helots. Modern scholars debate whether that matches a regular institution or a more sporadic rite. Either way, it signals a hard truth. Spartan military culture grows out of controlling a subject population. Discipline and fear are not side effects. They are the point. The political system supports the drill. 2 royal houses, the Ajads and the Eurypontids, share kingship and often disagree. A council of elders, the Gerousia, sets the agenda, elected ephors. 5 of them run much of the day-to-day and can embarrass kings in public. That balance produces caution in war and strict procedures on campaign. Before battle, seers perform sacrifices, looking for favorable omens. Xenophon's constitution of the Lacedaemonians lays out those rituals alongside the structural bits. The common messes, the hair policy, the rule that adult men eat and live with their mess group until age 30. That hair policy matters. Herodotus reports that Spartans wore their hair long, claiming it made beautiful men more handsome and ugly men more terrifying. The red cloak becomes a signature look. Plutarch says, the color hides blood. The more practical effect is uniformity and intimidation. Under the hood, the army runs on nested units. Xenophon, again, offers the clearest description, though scholars argue about exact numbers. The Inimotia forms the base, roughly 32 men in 2 files across a couple of ranks, commanded by an anomatarch. 2 Inimotiae make a Pentecostis, then 2 Pentecostis make a Loche, and several Loche make a Mora. The Mora often comes out to something between 600 and 900 men, commanded by a polar march. Numbers shift over time, and by situation, and arguments over counting methods can ruin a dinner party. The point is that Sparta builds a transparent chain of command with practiced subunits that can act together or split off cleanly. That structure lets them perform marching tricks and wheels that less drilled armies cannot manage. Battle by the book looks like this. The army advances to flute music, as Thucydides notes in Book 5 during the run-up to Mantinea in 418 bars. The flutes are not a garnish. They regulate marching pace, keep the line dressed, and calm nerves. The paean, a battle chant, rolls out. The Spartans often refuse a frantic charge. Instead, they step forward in time, using the weight of rows behind to push when the lines collide. The spear elbows forward, the shield locks. Panic lives in gaps. Spartan training hunts gaps out of existence. The 300 hippies, the royal guard, stand near the king. The term hippies causes confusion. It literally means horsemen. But in Sparta, it labels an elite hoplite bodyguard of 300 men selected annually. The real cavalry exists, but in small, unimpressive numbers. Agesilaus complains about it. Everybody else complains about it. Even in their heyday, Spartan horse is the kid who forgot equipment on game day. For all the iron ritual, Spartan tactics can flex. The Battle of Mantinea in 418 best shows it. The Spartans and their Peloponnesian allies face Argives, Mantineans, and Athenians. The Spartan right outflanks the enemy, due to the drift that naturally occurs in hoplite combat as men shield their right side by edging behind the man to their right. The key move comes from a pre-battle order. The Spartan right performs a sudden wheel to strengthen the endangered wing. Xenophon describes them handling this with unnerving smoothness. The result is a Spartan victory that restarts their reputation after some embarrassing years. Discipline wins, but not because Sparta invented magic. They just practiced the drill more. Thermopylae in 480 bets builds the brand. Leonidas leads roughly 300 Spartiates, along with about 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and other allies, into a choke point against Xerxes' invasion. Herodotus presents Spartans combing their long hair and performing exercises when Persian scouts show up. The scene hits like a movie trailer, and it is spectacular. Still, it is not a suicidal solo act. It's a tactical delay to choke a pass, while the fleet fights nearby. When the Persians find the Anapaea path with help from Ephialtes, the position collapses. Leonidas and his group stand and die. Myth swallows the numbers. It keeps the hair, the bright cloaks, and the line of bronze. It forgets the wider plan and the allies. That is the template for the Spartan story itself. A simple poster image wrapped around a more complicated reality. Plataea, in 479 Barch, shows the fully mature system. Pausanias commands the Spartan wing, and over all allied forces, against Mardonius and the Persian army. Herodotus gives the numbers emphasis that modern scholars always view with caution. But the structure stands. He lists 5,000 Spartiates, each accompanied by 7 helot light-armed, a figure that would put 35,000 helots on the field, plus 5,000 periokoi hoplites and their skirmishers. Doubt lives in the numbers. Confidence lives in the organization. The Spartans reposition overnight to reduce cavalry pressure, then stand until the right omens arrive. When engaged, they break the Persian center, kill Mardonius, and bring down the enemy camp. Spartan casualties are low, by Greek standards for a decisive battle. Herodotus names 91 Spartan dead. The result is the image of a cold, unstoppable wall. The myth has fingerprints of truth here. Then the story speeds up, and the machine shows both agility and cracks. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta fights a long grind against Athens. On land, Athens cannot beat Peloponnesian hoplites. At sea, Sparta cannot match Athenian triremes until Persian funding helps. Spartans eventually recruit allies, build a navy, and put Lysander in charge. Mesopotamia in 405 BC ends Athenian sea power. The land war ends with walls torn down and Sparta briefly dominant. The path there is not neat. Sphacteria in 425 BC shows the limits. Thucydides reports that 292 Spartan troops, including 120 Spartiates, surrender on the island after a series of aggressive moves by Athenian commander Demosthenes and his light-armed troops. The phrase "never surrender" crumples in detail. Sparta had surrendered men before. The shock is that elite citizens give up en masse. The response is tactical learning. Brasidas campaigns in the north with helot heavy infantry, who are promised freedom. Later, those freed helots become the Neodamodes, a class of emancipated soldiers. Sparta, grudgingly, expands the toolbox. By the later 5th century, the look evolves. The lander on shields, the big L for Lake Daimon, appears around the 420 SB. Before that, Spartan shields, like everyone else's, carry personal devices. Standardized insignia signals a state brand, flexing in public. Red cloaks become standard parade gear. Armor lightens. Xenophon talks about Spartans traveling light for quick moves. A bronze cuirass looks great in sculpture. Linen and leather breathe better during a forced march in August. The small stuff piles up until it becomes large. The syssitia, the common mess, is not a social club. It is a logistical machine that keeps men bonded to their unit and ensures regular contributions from land worked by helots. Those who cannot contribute regularly slide toward marginal status. Spartan full citizen numbers, the homoioi, shrink steadily from the 5th into the 4th century BAS. Plutarch and Aristotle note concerns about wealth concentration. By 371 BC, when the Thebans call their bluff at Leuctra, the pool of true Spartiates has collapsed to a few hundred on the field. Xenophon reports 700 Spartiates present, with around 400 killed. The shock is not just military, it is demographic. Training itself needs a reality check. The agoge produces tough, coordinated hoplites, but it is not an eternal parade of pain designed by a sadist. Xenophon admires it as practical. Plutarch retrofits a lot of spice for Roman readers. Archaeology and modern scholarship trim the edges. The infamous throwing babies off a cliff. Myth shows up in later sources as a misreading of inspections by elders at the lesh and infant exposure practices common in many Greek cities for physically deformed infants. There is no reliable contemporary evidence of routine infant murder at a chasm. The so-called pit of Cadus on Taygetus yields bones of traitors and criminals in later descriptions, not newborns. The core still bites. Spartan upbringing is communal, regulated, and hard. It prioritizes collective harmony over individual flash. It produces young men who can go hungry and still move, who can hold a formation in heat and fear, and who can execute orders without an open mic debate. Their rituals sprinkle strangeness with purpose. Before battle, the soothsayer takes the omens. The army sings. The flutes keep timing. Everyone wears hair long, oiled, and combed. Herodotus loves that detail because it freaked out the Persians. The 300 hippies stand near the king. The left wing often features Skiritai, light-armed or hoplite troops from the border district of Skiritais. They do scout work and night watches and often anchor the weak side. Plato mentions them as a distinct element. They are Sparta's fieldcraft specialists in a world of heavy infantry. And then the ground shifts again. The Corinthian War, roughly 395, 387 Bess, put Sparta up against a coalition of cities backed by Persian gold. Sparta still wins hoplite clashes, at Nemea in 394 for example, and still loses at sea, at Cnidus that same year. The Athenian light infantry revolution, personified by Iphicrates, catches Spartans flat-footed near Lechaeum in 390. This is not just a one-off. It is a tactical thesis. Light troops with mobility and javelins can break up hoplites if kept at range, and supported smartly. The Spartan shock reaction is to improve cavalry, hire more mercenaries, and add peltasts. Improvement exists, but the reputation for slow adaptation lingers because the brand resists change. Leuctra in 371 bars finishes the myth of invincibility. Epaminondas and Pelopidas bring Theban training and genius to the field. The Thebans stack their left wing 50 ranks deep with the sacred band and elite hoplites. They refuse the weaker wing and aim the heavy column straight at the Spartan right, where the Spartiate elite traditionally stands. The result is a car crash in slow motion. Oblique order meets rigid tradition, and mass wins. Spartan morale dents when their best soldiers fall in front of them. Xenophon's account, grudging and tight-lipped, still shows the catastrophe. After Leuctra, Theban general Epaminondas marches into the Peloponnese, frees Messenia in 369 BC, and builds the new city of Messene. That move hits the Spartan economy like an axe. The Helot labor base is gone. The agorge without surplus food turns into a slogan without a budget. A last surge of Spartan reinvention arrives 2 centuries later, with Cleomenes IV Knight ruling 235, 222 bar. Polybius narrates a busy reformer. Land redistribution to rebuild the citizen body, freeing 6,000 helots to raise money and hiring mercenaries. The true plot twist lands in the drill yard. Cleomenes outfits phalangites and trains a chunk of his army in Macedonian style, with the sarissa, a pike of 5 to 6 meters. The enemy is Antigonus III, Doson of Macedon. The battlefield is Salacia in 222 bar. The Spartan force includes this new pike phalanx blended with older hoplites. The experiment ends in defeat, but the message is clear. Even Sparta, the fossil of hoplite virtue, tries to trade the aspis for a pike if the strategic situation demands it. Reinvention comes too late. After Salacia, Sparta slides into Hellenistic minor power status, then into Roman-era museum piece, the place where tourists watch a revival of whip contests and hear old war songs without worrying about helot uprisings. Training inside the Ago deserves another close look because it defines everything else. Boys at age 7 enter packs under an older iron who drills them in endurance, stealth, and group loyalty. They go barefoot. They wear 1 cloak per year. They sleep on reeds, according to Plutarch, gathered from the Eurotas. At age 12, haircuts get standardized, and clothing is minimized. Public shaming and competition harden social boundaries. Choral songs by Teteris feed them a soundtrack of honor and shame. Wrestling, running, and the pancration teach grappling and speed, not flash technique. Swordsmanship is not fetishized. The Scyphos, the short sword, is a backup tool after the spear breaks or the ranks jam. The kopis, a single-edged slashing blade, appears in Spartan contexts, but not as universal kit. The message stays intact. In the line, everyone is a cog, not a soloist. The Syssitia sits at the center of adult life. Men dine nightly with their mess group, joke there, share food there, and vote on accepting new members. The food is famously plain. The black broth, melas, zomos, gets dragged across sauces as Spartan cuisine's badge of honor and trauma. Meat and blood stew, simple and salty. Greeks from elsewhere mock it. The humor covers a serious function. The mess enforces equality by ritual, though wealth inequality still widens over time. It also sets the stage for fast mobilization. A unit that eats together, marches together without admin lag. Spartan women shape the soldier factory in practical ways. They inherit property more often than in other Greek cities, partly because men die on campaign and land needs managing. They train in running, wrestling, and throwing, not to make them warriors but to produce strong children and manage households while men eat black soup and iron discipline. Their prominence in inscriptions and in critical commentary from other Greeks shines a blue light on the Spartan system. The citizen body gets warped around war and property, and women move into the gaps. Aristotle criticizes Spartan women for luxury and for undermining the Lycurgan laws by controlling land. The criticism admits a fact. The militarized life of men leaves women holding the economic keys, and those keys slowly unlock the door to wealth concentration and citizen decline. Let the myth-busting continue. Spartans did not wear capes into battle like comic book heroes. The red cloak is for marching and ceremonial displays. On the field, heavy armor varies by period. Their famous laconic wit existed, but it existed alongside a walled garden of elaborate ritual and slow bureaucracy. Their economy was not money-free. Sparta famously avoided coinage for a while, using iron spit currency by tradition, but by the 5th and 4th centuries, they used precious metal when it suited them, particularly when bribing allies and operating in the wider Greek world. After 404 Bess, Persian money flows into Spartan hands, and suddenly the very ascetics of Greece learn to pay for fleets and mercenaries like everyone else. The idea that Spartans never broke formations crumbles under pressure from the sources. A disciplined withdrawal appears often. Pursuit is controlled. Reckless chase is taboo. When flanked or surprised, Spartans can be routed, as at Sphacteria or later at Leuctra. They are not magic. They are trained humans. The Spartan army's soft power should be called out because it matters as much as bronze. Phalanx warfare depends on trust and timing. Every city tries to teach that. Sparta hardwires it with a lifetime of group behavior. School, mess, army, campaign, ritual. All of it says stand in the line. Titerius writes verses that frame dying in the front rank as the best fate and living as a coward as a stain that sticks. The system does not produce elite athletes. It produces rhythm. That rhythm allows fiddly tactics, like the pre-battle right wheel at Mantinea and quick night repositionings in the Plataea campaign. The flutes are not aesthetics. They are metronomes. Equipment details push the story forward. The aspis, also called the hoplon in modern books, though ancient Greeks used hoplon to mean any gear, works like a door with a handle in the middle. The pulpax handles slip onto the forearm. The antelabe at the rim is gripped by the hand. The rim covers the man to the left more than the self. Hence the drift right. The spear's butt spike, the soroter, allows planting on the ground and finishing wounded foes when the spearhead snaps. Greaves protect shins. Sandals show up, but bare feet are common. Helmets shift from Corinthian full-face types to open-faced pylos caps over the 5th century, freeing vision and hearing. Spartan use of the pylos becomes a recognizable photograph in bronze. The shield device, the lambda, signifies shared identity after the 420s. Before that, Spartan shields show varied motifs, which means personal swagger existed and got sanded away when the state branded the army. Organizational quirks reveal the mind of the machine. The selection of the 300 hippies as the royal bodyguard involves an annual merit-based choice by elders, based on performance in the agoge and the common messes. That turnover keeps ambition hot and creates a pipeline of capable officers. Cavalry organization grows, eventually to 4 hipparchies in some periods, but the quality remains uneven. The Skiritai hold the left, often numbering around 600, according to Thucydides, acting as scouts and flank guards. The Neodamidites become an extra class of heavy infantry freed from helot status after long service. Sparta uses this social ladder to plug holes in the citizen body and to reward overperformance. Religion ties knots around strategy. Sparta often delays movement for the Carnea festival in late summer, and that sacred calendar can cost or save lives. In 490 birth, during the Marathon campaign, they arrive after the full moon due to religious restrictions, a detail Herodotus loves as an example of piety bent into real-world constraints. In 480 birth, Spartan king Demaratus, dethroned and advising Xerxes, tells Persian ears that the Spartans are brave because they fear their laws more than any enemy. That line sounds like prayer, but it holds water. Spartan fight behavior comes from enforcement by shame and law as much as from training and courage. The handling of helots is the silent baseline in every Spartan military note. Revolts happen. The Great Helot Revolt of 464 Bess, after an earthquake nearly topples the state. Thucydides records it. The Helots Imperio of Thoria and Achaia seize Mount Ithone. The war drags on for years. Sparta asks Athens for help, then sends them away out of distrust. The event fractures alliances and births the Athenian-Spartan rivalry that becomes the Peloponnesian War. More practically, it confirms the Spartan rule. Soldiers cannot be away forever. Campaigns have to be short or supported by reliable allies, because the home front is a live grenade. Not every part of the Spartan system is uniquely Spartan. Choral dance and war songs are pan-Greek. Hoplite kit is pan-Greek, but no other city glues these elements into a lifelong program with this much stubbornness. Athens trains rowers for fleet excellence, which requires a different kind of discipline. Thebes trains a small elite, the sacred band, paired lovers who fight in a 300-strong unit. Macedon later builds a professionalized army with deep pike formations, combined arms, and constant drilling. In that company, Sparta represents the peak expression of citizen hoplite culture, not its only expression. That context recalibrates Thermopylae and Plataea again. At Thermopylae, Spartan tactical doctrine fits the terrain. The narrow pass neutralizes Persian cavalry and missiles. The hand-picked Spartan contingent is designed to hold a choke point while the fleet fights at Artemisium. At Plataea, the same doctrine expands to a large, open field. The strict refusal to chase too far, the obsession with good ground, and the priority on not breaking formation come from a doctrine aimed at avoiding ambush by light troops and cavalry. The good news version, it works. The bad news version, the discipline can become rigidity when someone shows up with a new playbook. Other battles dot the map. Tegea, Argos, and Arcadian wars in the 6th century build a pre-Persian reputation for Spartan victory in hoplite clashes. Modon and Pylos show coastal weak spots. Gylippus, a Spartan commander with a talent for siegecraft and politics, saves Syracuse in 414 to 413 by reorganizing defenses and cutting off Athenian lines. A reminder that Spartan leadership occasionally extends beyond the phalanx. Agesilaus campaigns in Asia Minor in 396-394 Bess drills his men and wins neat tactical victories against Persian satraps at Sardis. Money and politics pull him back to Greece, and the momentum fades. Everything circles back to the training ground. The Ago core creates behavioral muscle memory. That memory fixes tactics in place until it has to flex. After Sphacteria, Spartans integrate more archers and javelin men. By the later 5th century, the army fields mixed contingents more often. After Lechaeum, Spartan polemarchs become wary of open terrain without supporting skirmishers. After Leuctra, reformers like Agesilaus, and later Cleomenes III, experiment with new formations and different weapons. The story of the Spartan military is not a straight line from Lycurgus to Leonidas to collapse. It is a sine wave of adaptation and pride, with the amplitude controlled by budgets, helot management, and whether neighboring cities have invented a new way to break lines. Even language gets drafted into the army. The term homo oi equals suggests that full citizens share status and training. In reality, property requirements and politics create layers like sediment. The hypomeanis, the downgraded, lose full status for failing to contribute to the mess or for public shame. The tresontes, the tremblers, become a cursed category of men with cowardice charges stuck to their names. These labels perform social enforcement. A man risks becoming a cautionary tale if he underperforms. That narrative pressure gets results. It also turns the society into a performance staged for itself, where identity and army blur together. The armor glitters less when held up to the light of casualty math. Herodotus' glowing figures for Plataea include 5,000 hoplites from Sparta proper. But by the 420s, the citizen body already shrinks. Stephen Hodkinson and Paul Cartledge, among others, trace the drop to inheritance patterns, war losses, and tightening definitions of citizenship based on property. By the time of Xenophon, who knows Sparta intimately, The number of full Spartiates is down in the low thousands and falling. At Leuctra, 700 Spartiates stand in the front line. Around 400 die. That scale of loss cannot be absorbed by a society that insists on high standards and limited entry points. This decline does not erase the tactical fingerprints Sparta leaves on Greek warfare. Refused flanks and controlled wheels spread. The cultural respect for drill echoes in Macedonian practice, though Philip the Tall and Alexander push well beyond hoplite methods. Even the habit of using music for cadence survives. Roman armies later used trumpets and cornicines for signals, a different instrument for a similar purpose. The Spartan emphasis on depth of ranks finds occasional experiments elsewhere, including Theban ultra-deep columns before Leuctra. The lesson rockets forward through time. Discipline beats swagger when lines collide. Modern pop culture builds a new Sparta out of hero worship and gym footage. That Sparta is good TV and bad history. It leaves out helots, periokoi, and Persian funding. It forgets that at Sphacteria, 120 Spartiates surrendered and embarrassed every slogan on the city's walls. It glides past Iphicrates peltasts and their deadly dance at Lechaim. It turns Thermopylae into a standalone tragedy and forgets Plataea's victory based on organizational patience. It turns the Agoge into a 24/7 death course and leaves out choral dance, poetry, and the practicality of stealing cheese without getting caught. The real Sparta is tougher, meaner, and weirder. It is a state that makes boys walk barefoot to learn the terrain, and many together to make logistics an identity. It is a city that refuses to march during a religious festival, and then shows up on the third day of the Battle of Plataea to take down the Persian center. It is a society that tries to rearm with sarissas when the hoplite script stops paying dividends. The appeal of the myth still deserves respect. Spartan laconic lines delivered the internet's favorite deadpan. The most famous one focuses on the promise implicit in a shield. Plutarch preserves mothers telling men to return with it or on it, even if that line reflects a cultural stereotype more than a documentable everyday speech. The shield ethic sits at the core of the machine. The shield protects the man to the left. Drop it, and the line breaks. The equipment teaches the ethics. The ethics teach the tactics. The tactics teach the training. That loop defines the Spartan military at its best. A last scene locks the story. The Theban column at Leuctra punches through the Spartan right. The sacred band, 300 deep lovers in files, breaks the line that symbolized hoplite perfection for 2 centuries. The field fills with bodies. Xenophon, a friend to Sparta, writes with anger and sorrow, but does not hide the key fact. The Spartans do not recover that day, or that century. Messenia becomes independent. The helot base disappears. Sparta keeps the Agoge and the messes, but the cash flow and prestige leak out. Later kings stage reforms. Later Roman stage tours. The training remains austere, and the tactics still look crisp in parade, but the heart of the machine beats softly. The evolution of Spartan training and tactics reads like a case study in how a small community can build disproportionate power through social engineering, then fail to adapt at the pace of technology and demography. Out of Messenian conquest comes a fortress society built to stand. Out of the Agoge comes a human metronome. Out of Plataea comes prestige. Out of Sphacteria comes humility. Out of Iphicrates comes warning. Out of Leuctra comes collapse. That arc is not a moral tale. It is a logistics tale, a political tale, and a tactics tale, with footnotes by Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, Plutarch, Aristotle, and Polybius. It ends not with a slogan, but with a lesson that travels well. Build discipline. Learn fast. Do not confuse a brand with a strategy. Now, the small, fast facts that anchor the story settle into place. Hoplite spears commonly measure 2.7 meters. Macedonian sarissas run up to 5-6 meters. The Spartan mora weighs in around 600 to 900 men. Skiritai often number around 600. The famous surrender at Sphacteria yields 292 prisoners, with 120 Spartiates among them. Leuctra put 700 Spartiates in the front line. Around 400 die. Plataea ends with 91 Spartan dead. If Herodotus's numbers hold, the lambda shield emblem appears around the 420 SBs. The Crypteia gets described by Plutarch centuries after the classical peak, and modern doubts about its exact form remain reasonable. The black broth exists, and non-Spartans hate it. The flutes at Mantinea are not CGI. The red cloak belongs in the marching column, not in a slow-motion close-up on the killing ground. Sparta's best tactic remains invisible to most eyes. It sits in the habit of entire classes, spending nights together, eating together, and marching together until they can pivot a battle line, like a door on a hinge without panicking. It sits in the decision to hold a pass at Thermopylae, to buy time for a fleet, and to refuse a rash pursuit at Plataea to avoid a cavalry ambush. It sits in the humility of a world-class athletic city that knows it has to bring flutes to a spear fight because timing is deadlier than rage. The end comes quietly. Rome absorbs Greek politics, one treaty at a time. Spartan kings argue, reform, and fail. Nabis, the last spiky ruler in the early 2nd century Barsh, shakes up property and presses for power before Roman force flattens his ambitions. Sparta becomes a byword for severity and a museum of itself. The agoge turns into performance. The tactics become nostalgia. The myth becomes merch. The story that remains holds its edge without needing cosplay. A small city with a nasty helot problem built a social machine that turned free citizens into a synchronized heavy infantry system, decades before most others could imitate it. That machine won landmark battles, endured hard shocks, and died on the wrong end of a tactical revolution in 371 BES. The evolution of Spartan training and tactics is not a climb to heroism, but a spiral around fear, discipline, invention, and rigidity. The facts carry their own drama. The rest is a red cloak, billowing in a wind that never quite blew in Laconia the way the posters promised. He walks on stage in 1893 and starts wearing lightning like jewelry. At the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, in a hall already buzzing from the first World's Fair, entirely lit by electric light, he brings out coils that roar and snap blue-white, steps into the glow, and lets high-frequency, high-voltage current fly over his skin, while glass tubes in his hands light up with no wires attached. The audience stares at a man calmly demonstrating something that, 5 minutes earlier, sounded like a death sentence. That's Nikola Tesla's entrance into the popular imagination. Electricity turned into theatre. Science turned into a spectacle that reframed the whole argument about power. The war of currents suddenly looks less like a debate and more like a preview of the future. The war already had casualties. 2 years earlier, in 1891, he'd become a US citizen and introduced the Tesla coil, a device that could step up voltage to dizzying levels and produce the showstopper arcs seen in those photos that never stopped trending. One of those famous images, Tesla sitting casually in a chair while a web of lightning sprawls around him, was a double exposure by photographer Dickinson v. Alley. The coils were real. The calm reading session with a miniature storm formed around his head was photographic theatre rather than an OSHA violation. He knew showmanship mattered. He also knew the engineering had to back it up. Back up it did. The problem at the heart of 19th century electricity was not the light bulb. It was how to spin motors and move power over serious distances without wasting it as heat. Direct current systems, the Edison standard of the 1880s, were clunky at scale. Transformers liked alternating current. Polyphase didn't just transform. It created a rotating magnetic field that could spin a motor without mechanical commutators eating themselves alive. Tesla's key leap landed in 1882, a visualization of a rotating magnetic field that came to him while he worked in Europe for the Continental Edison Company. In 1887 and 1888, after arriving in the US in 1884 and doing a brief, volatile stint at Edison's New York works, he filed a cluster of patents describing polyphase AC motors and power transmission. On May 16, 1888, he addressed the American Institute of Electrical Engineers in New York and laid out the system. Multiple out-of-phase AC currents, creating a rotating field. Induction motors that run with no brushes, and efficient, long-distance power via transformers. AE members who knew the math saw it. George Westinghouse, a locomotive of an industrialist who had been betting on AS since 1886, saw it and signed Tesla to a deal that put real money behind the theory. The internet's favorite morality play often rewrites what happened next as an Edison versus Tesla cage match. The truth looks messier and meaner. Edison's name wasn't on the electric chair, but his company's ally, Harold P. Brown, was campaigning hard in 1880-1890 to frame alternating current as dangerous, staging public demonstrations in which dogs and calves were killed with AC. The first execution by AC of a human, William Kemmler in 1890 at Auburn Prison, was botched and gruesome. That spectacle was used to smear the technology behind Tesla's motors and Westinghouse's power plants. It worked on headlines, and it backfired on physics. Engineers kept running the numbers. Losses over distance crushed DC. Transformers demanded AC. Polyphase made the motors efficient. The trade journals that mattered to procurement departments kept publishing facts. Tesla's deal with Westinghouse, the one with the rumored royalty of $2.50 per horsepower of AC equipment sold, became the stuff of legend. The dollar figure was real enough in early agreements. The iconic anecdote of Tesla gallantly tearing up the contract to save Westinghouse during financial stress in 1897 provides the cinematic moment, and it fits Tesla's later public persona a little too well. Archival records show renegotiations, not a single paper-tearing sacrificial gesture. The result was not a fairy tale. He accepted a lump sum. Contemporary accounts put it in the low six figures, which, adjusted for inflation, would still calm most bank accounts today. It wasn't the kind of recurring royalty that would have made him the richest engineer in the world. The legend traveled because it hits a nerve about genius and money. That blend of performance and performance anxiety defines 1893. Chicago's fair was an electrical event as much as a cultural one. Westinghouse beat Edison General Electric for the lighting contract, and those few hundred acres of buildings and boulevards glowed with AC. Tesla lectured, demonstrated his coils, and helped explain fluorescence and high-frequency current effects to people who had trouble imagining electricity doing anything besides burning filaments. He also introduced a charming prop called the Egg of Columbus, a copper egg set to spinning by a concealed polyphase motor until it stood on end. Point made. Rotate the field, and the egg stands up. It's textbook physics turned into a carnival trick that still convinces. 2 years later, the place where copper eggs no longer needed to convince anyone began turning water into power on an industrial scale. The Niagara Falls project had been a global engineering beauty contest in the early 1890s. Giants like Lord Kelvin weighed in. The eventual choice was a Westinghouse Tesla-style 25 Hz, three-phase ACS system. The Adams power plant opened in 1895 with three 5,000 horsepower turbines, and over the next few years grew to 10 units. On November 16, 1896, the line to Buffalo went live, carrying AC at around 11,000 volts over roughly 20 miles. Municipal meters spun, factories powered up. Editorial boards that had swallowed Brown's public fear campaign placed their next orders with Westinghouse. The war of currents ended not in court, but on a map. Cities chose the grid that could reach them. That same year, while Niagara cemented the legacy he had laid out in 1880, he watched a nightmare unfold at his own lab in New York. On March 13, 1895, a fire tore through his South Fifth Avenue workshop. Years of notebooks and instruments went up in smoke. In that lab he had been working on experiments with Crookes tubes and high-frequency discharges that produced images of bones and other shadowgraphs before Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen announced X-rays publicly in late 1895. Tesla sent Röntgen images of a foot in a shoe and a hand with rings, and wrote about burns from these new rays in 1896. The chronology matters. He did not beat Röntgen to public disclosure, and he never claimed the discovery. He did explore the phenomenon quickly and deeply, early enough to get burned by it, and to publish practical warnings in Electrical Review. He wrote about fluorescent screens, about filters, and about calibrating exposure. He sometimes served as his own test subject. It was very on-brand. Then came radio. The internet loves a single inventor showdown, and this story refuses to cooperate. Tesla described a tuned resonance system for wireless signaling in 1893 lectures, and filed patents in 1897 for fundamental components. A transmitter and receiver with tuned circuits and a means to ground and elevate for better coupling. Guglielmo Marconi, hustling with relentless clarity, pushed rapid, practical demonstrations starting in 1895, filed patents, and in 1901 spanned the Atlantic with an S signal. The U.S. Patent Office whipsawed over who owned what in fundamental radio. In 1904, Marconi's core patent slipped through in the United States, leveraging both European momentum and investor muscle, despite Tesla's earlier filings. The confusion lasted for decades. In 1943, months after Tesla died in New York, the U.S. Supreme Court in Marconi Wireless Telegraph Co. of America, the United States voided Marconi's prior patent claims on certain fundamental circuits, citing earlier work by Tesla as well as by Oliver Lodge and John Stone. The ruling didn't hand radio to a single hero. It did erase the idea that Marconi owned all of it. Tesla's tuned circuits and energy transfer concepts remained foundational. The textbooks got a little messier and a lot more accurate. Wireless in Tesla's hands didn't stop at dots and dashes. In 1898, at an electrical exhibition at Madison Square Garden, he drove a small boat around a pool without touching it. He called it a teleautomaton. The controls were radio. The audience fidgeted between amazement and conspiracy theory. In a city that still loved spirit mediums and stage magicians, a chunk of the crowd assumed there had to be someone inside the boat. There wasn't. The US Navy considered the technology in past. The idea of weapons without crews struck the admirals as eccentric. The idea itself aged extremely well. By World War I, radio control ideas were being explored for torpedoes. By the 21st century, entire categories of engineering revolve around remote and autonomous systems. The Garden demonstration stays legendary because it made the future look silly and inevitable at the same time. Colorado Springs ramped up the drama even further. In 1899, he set up a laboratory there to build a massive version of a Tesla coil tuned for what he called the magnifying transmitter. Numbers here get fuzzy because the prayer machine outpaced the lab notebooks. But some facts land solidly. The wooden building stood on a plane. The roof could be slid open, and a coil system inside could throw sparks dozens of feet long. The setup produced arcs reported at over 30 feet, and luminous discharges that rolled around the building like St. Elmo's fire. He tapped the local power station for energy, and once blew out their generator, with a surge so extreme that the company cut him off until he covered damages. He documented the atmospheric electrical phenomena he observed. He believed that the Earth could act as a conductor and resonator for energy. He claimed to have lit lamps at a distance, without wires. That last claim sits in the grey zone between his statements and independent confirmation. The spectacular photos and newspaper write-ups turned the lab into legend. The substation repair bill confirmed that something truly wild had happened. Engineers still combed through his Colorado laboratory notebook, looking for numbers useful beyond myth. He wanted to bottle that spectacle into infrastructure. Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island was the project. A tall wooden tower about 187 feet high, capped with a 68-foot steel dome, linked to a deep ground connection via a shaft over 100 feet down and a forest of iron pipes sunk further still. He secured backing in 1901 from J. P. Morgan, a financier who preferred results over poetry, roughly $150,000 to build a global wireless telegraphy station and a base for a worldwide wireless communications network. Tesla's ambitions drifted from telegraphy toward wireless power transmission. Investors did not share that shift. Marconi's transatlantic success in late 1901 destroyed the sense that Tesla's station would be the first to cross an ocean. Construction lumbered forward. Costs ballooned, and Morgan cut him off. The tower's dome glinted over Shoreham anyway. He ran tests that produced light and thunder for local townspeople. Newspaper headlines loved it. Financing did not return. In 1917, during wartime paranoia about saboteurs, the tower was demolished. The official cause was more practical than cinematic. Wardenclyffe's mortgage, held ultimately by the Waldorf Astoria to cover Tesla's hotel debts, was being reconciled. The site was sold, and the timber and metal scrapped. The legend that the US government blew it up to silence. A beam weapon makes excellent late-night radio. The line in the accounting ledger tells a much less dramatic truth, and the inventions kept arriving even as the finances thinned. The induction motor and the axe system had already reshaped industry by the late 1890s. He contributed a coil that broadcast high-frequency current into labs and lecture halls worldwide. He carried out pioneering work with X-rays around 1894, 1897, and he wrote early and accurately about their hazards. He developed a variometer, the variable inductor that helped tune circuits. He improved vacuum tubes and experimented with gas discharge lamps. He patented an electrical ignition system for engines that later car designs echoed. He designed a bladeless turbine with smooth discs designed to drag a fluid through via the boundary layer, aiming for high rotational speeds and straightforward manufacturing. He demonstrated versions in 1906, 1913, with reports of outputs on the order of tens of horsepower on compressed air and steam in small-scale tests. Industrial uptake never arrived because materials, seal tolerances, and efficiency comparisons with bladed turbines and pistons didn't favor it. It still lures garage inventors because of its elegance. The engineering journals from that period file it under beautiful idea, tricky in practice. He wrote, like a man with a mission statement for civilization. His 1900 essay in Century magazine, The Problem of Increasing Human Energy, reads like a manifesto for clean, organized power. He calculated in cold numbers how much coal humanity would burn, and then proposed smarter use of energy and better distribution. In 1908 and 1909, he described a global wireless network that would eventually let people carry small instruments and communicate instantly across oceans, with images, text, and voice transmitted through the air. The details didn't predict packet switching. The direction predicted everything else. Listening to him describe a pocket device for global communication feels eerie only to people who haven't looked at a smartphone and a cell tower and noticed the shape of the dream. Then there are the myths that glue themselves to a name like that. One involves a $50,000 bonus Edison supposedly promised in 1884, 1885 for improving his dynamos, followed by a joke about American humor when it wasn't paid. Tesla wrote that anecdote himself in his 1919 memoir, and historians can't find contemporary evidence for the offer. He did work for Edison Machine Works and did leave after a salary dispute. The snub story satisfies the narrative that the dull businessman mocked the brilliant engineer. The documentation suggests personality and pay friction rather than a literal joke and a tearful exit. Another myth centers on Topsy, the elephant in 1903. Electrocuted on Coney Island by Luna Park personnel who had turned to electricity as a supposedly humane option. After a series of failed rehoming and aggression incidents, Edison's film crew recorded it. Because Edison's company filmed a lot of things, Edison himself did not execute the elephant, and the event happened a decade after the War of Currents had effectively ended. It stays attached to Tesla's era anyway, because the whole chapter about electricity needed a villain. The villain of that particular story is cruelty, not a wiring diagram. He did court publicity for things he likely could not deliver. He announced, in 1934, a defensive teleforce system, a particle beam projected through the air. He wrote about accelerated particles, electrically charged and collimated, capable of bringing down aircraft at hundreds of miles. He sought government interest and funding. The concepts drew on electrostatics and vacuum technology, and the power sources of the 1930s, and the beam physics of the day made it a press release instead of a prototype. He claimed mechanical resonance with his small steam-driven oscillator could shake a building and trigger a neighborhood panic in the 1890s. He told that story decades later to a reporter. Neighbors and police paperwork don't match the drama. He fed those tales because he believed in the principles behind the hyperbole. He also understood the value of keeping people talking. He wasn't all show. He immersed himself in meticulous, sometimes obsessive routines. He ate dinner at precise hours in New York hotels, reportedly requiring stacks of napkins and careful plate counts. He hated pearls and refused to speak to women wearing them. He walked exactly counted laps around blocks in Manhattan. He slept little and wrote constantly. These details come from friends, secretaries, and reporters who wrote about him at the time. They humanize the myth and complicate the simplistic genius stereotype. He was tall, around 6'2", with a voice that could carry a lecture hall, without amplification and a conductor's sense of timing on stage. He was an immigrant who kept a lifelong accent, who loved his mother's memory and carried the tragedy of his brother's death. At age 12, like a hidden pressure source, he could file extraordinarily precise patents and then deliver grand claims to newspapers that sounded like the opening act for science fiction. The financial arc never matched the intellectual one. He earned serious sums in the 1880s and 1890s. He lost the steady pipeline of licensing revenue by renegotiating key deals and by outpacing what the market could absorb. Wardenclyffe turned into a financial sinkhole. Lawsuits drained attention and cash. By the 1910s and 1920s, he lived on credits from old friends and new sponsors. At the St. Regis, the Hotel Pennsylvania, the Waldorf Astoria, and later the Hotel New Yorker, he fed pigeons in Bryant Park, and outside his windows, he told biographer John J. O'Neill in the 1940s about a special white pigeon he loved and about a vision of light when she died. The story reads like a parable someone might invent. It came from him. People who knew him understood that he used symbolic language when talking about pain. His 75th birthday in 1931 brought a flood of tribute letters from physicists and engineers, and Time magazine put his face on the cover with bolts of stylized lightning for the occasion. The editor knew the audience. The science ranked. The spectacle still mattered. He received the A. Edison Medal in 1917, accepted on the second try after initially declining. Having a prize named after Edison pinned on Tesla has a tidy symmetry. The I and the Institute of Radio Engineers eventually merged into the I, and a global network of electrical engineers grew up under a banner that in many ways he helped make necessary. Some legal and political apologue lines linger for people who like official stamps. He died in room 3,327 at the Hotel New Yorker on January 7, 1943, at 86. The Office of Alien Property Custodian, at the FBI's request, sealed his papers, even though he had been a U.S. citizen since 1891. The government wanted to make sure nothing militarily sensitive walked out. An Amit professor named John G. Trump, a specialist in high-voltage engineering, reviewed the technical documents for the government. His report concluded that they contained nothing of practical use to national defense, lots of speculative ideas, and the kind of conceptual leaps that drew headlines without circuit diagrams. The papers later moved through a complex path involving his nephew Sava Kosanovich, museums in Belgrade, and decades of archivists and scholars. The internet tries to turn that story into a spy thriller. In reality, it was bureaucracy acting like bureaucracy around a scientist who never stopped aiming past the next hill. The headline list of achievements stands up without the ghost stories. The induction motor he devised in the late 1880s became the workhorse of factories, fans, pumps, and everything that spins in modern life. The polyphase axe system he sketched and patented made national grids possible and efficient, letting power leap from waterfalls and steam turbines to cities hundreds of miles away. The Tesla coil became a laboratory instrument, a showpiece for educators, and a critical tool in early radio experiments. His work with high-frequency currents, advanced understanding of dielectric behavior, and insulation. His early exploration of X-rays paralleled other pioneers and was significant enough to generate both images and safety warnings. His patents on wireless signaling and tuned circuits anchored the theoretical and practical evolution of radio. His 1898 radio-controlled boat counted as one of the first public demonstrations of unmanned systems. His ideas about global wireless communication anticipated a world saturated with radio. The numbers underpin the poetry. He filed more than 100 U.S. patents. 112 is the commonly cited count, and around 300 patents worldwide. The turbines at Niagara started at 5,000 horsepower each, a 10-pack energized by Westinghouse, alternators that set a megawatt-scale template in the 1890s. The Buffalo transmission line ran roughly 20 miles at about 11 kilovolts, stepping down for distribution, operating at 25 hertz to suit heavy industry of the day. He gave major lectures in 1891 and 1893 on high-frequency AC, published with schematics and quantitative data through journals like the Electrical Engineer and the Transactions of the AC. Newspapers from the New York Times to the Electrical Review covered his demonstrations, often with both breathless prose and careful measurements. The Supreme Court case that referenced his priority on radio circuits is 320 U.S. Cates, is 320 U.S. 1. 1943. A citation that sneaks into radio engineering histories like a quiet correction. The 1960 General Conference on Weights and Measures put his name on the psi unit for magnetic flux density, the Tesla pinning his identity to the strength of a magnetic field, a tidy compliment to a man who fell in love with rotating fields in his 20s. Debunking the New Age add-ons does not weaken the story. He did not build a machine that crushes free energy out of the vacuum, and he never claimed to. He did not stop time in a New York basement. He did not weaponize Wardenclyffe into a planet-spanning laser. He did write about tapping energy in the ambient environment, meaning solar, wind, and other accessible sources. And he cared deeply about efficient transmission. He did not invent fluorescent lighting, as the modern world knows it, but he did produce glowing glass tubes with high-frequency currents years before fluorescent lamps became standard products. He predicted a globally networked, wireless future with portable receivers in vivid language, and he reached for it through resonant circuits and towers. He contributed to the earliest days of radio while other brilliant engineers did the same. He turned the induction motor from a classroom trick into industrial gear. The romance in that list already humbles fiction. The war of currents itself, boiled down from pamphlets and headlines into engineering, comes to rest on the Niagara Project and the Chicago Fair as the turning points. The technical journals describe breaker designs, transformer oil, and the way 25 Hz power hummed differently than 60 Hz if a person listened to the machines. The financing captured Westinghouse's risk and, by extension, Tesla's. The politics dragged Edison General Electric into limbo and then into a merger that created an industrial titan without the old condescension toward AC. Within a decade, AC systems powered cities from Berlin to Buffalo. By 1910, AC had eclipsed DC for municipal generation and distribution across the United States and much of Europe. DC retreated underground, literally and figuratively, and later returned in the 20th century as high-voltage DC for very long-distance transmission and niche uses. That comeback didn't cancel anything from the 1890s. It proved that once engineers have multiple tools, the best tool wins for the job. He arrived in New York in 1884 with lots of ambition and little cash. His own recollection mentioned 4 cents in his pocket, a poem, and a letter from Charles Batchelor, Edison's trusted lieutenant. The letter supposedly read like a VIP pass, and it helped. Tesla's baggage got lost on the trip. Punctuation got lost in the next few decades of telling and retelling. He was born in 1856 in Smiljan, then part of the Austrian Empire, now in Croatia, to an Orthodox priest father, Milutin Tesla, and a mother, Duka Mandic, who built household tools and had a knack for practical engineering that everyone in the family noticed. He studied at Graz, starting in 1875, then in Prague, though records suggest he never finished a degree. He learned in class and in late-night bursts. He worked for the Budapest Telephone Exchange in 1881, then for the Continental Edison Company in Paris in 1882, troubleshooting DC plants and building out practical electrical systems across Europe until New York pulled him across an ocean. Aside from the AC system and radio's foundation stones, the Tesla coil has a legacy worth savoring. It isn't just a noise machine from science museums. It's a transformer with a resonant twist, a spark gap or powered oscillator that drives a primary coil tank capacitor circuit with a secondary tuned to the same frequency. The result is not only shocking in the colloquial sense, it's an elegant piece of resonance engineering that helps understand and test insulation limits and radiator behavior at radio frequencies. Classic early radio transmitters used spark gap systems before vacuum tubes took over. The coil's ghost wanders through almost every generation of RF engineering, sometimes as a teaching tool, sometimes as a test bed, sometimes as the centerpiece of a musician's stage show. The reason a Tesla coil can throw a jagged purple arc across a room sits downstream of the same physics that lets a modern smartphone grab a Wi-Fi signal through a wall. He made incandescent lights burn brighter in his lab, and then made a nation's grid make sense. He tried to map the Earth's charge, and then tried to use that charge as a wire. He pushed publicity to the point of self-sabotage. He let rivers talk his ideas across a continent. The humor here writes itself. He spooked investors by pitching power from the sky, while simultaneously giving them a power plant that ran on waterfall mathematics. He accepted the Edison Medal and then cracked jokes about metaphysics to reporters instead of raising capital to build a factory. He created a remote-controlled boat in an era when radios were finicky and audiences thought hypnosis did the steering. He played with ultraviolet light and X-rays so raw he burned his skin and kept going with the experiments anyway, because in that moment the borderline between curiosity and courage got blurry. His last years were thin on cash and thick with ceremony. The King of Yugoslavia sent medals. Student clubs cheered. Reporters remembered the lightning photos. He answered mail from school children with warm encouragement and sometimes with technical advice sprinkled into the compliments. He lived at the New Yorker Hotel, spent afternoons with pigeons and schemed inventions in his head that rarely found a machine shop. He died in early January 1943. The city that had once watched him throw lightning kept moving. The war consumed attention and materials. His name slid into textbooks and footnotes, while his image stayed on posters and in pulp magazines. Then the unit of magnetic flux density became the Tesla in 1960, a quiet monument in the language of measurement. The Niagara generating station became a museum piece and a case study in engineering courses. His Colorado lab notebooks drew engineers who loved the smell of ozone in their imaginations. The Eye named an award for him. A museum in Belgrade, built out of his papers, opened admirers' eyes to the density of his drawings and the thinness of his wallets. The Supreme Court case that corrected radio's genealogy built a legal footnote into his obituary. The internet arrived and did what it does to myths. Some inflated, others got punctured with scans of old journals. Historians like W. Bernard Carlson and Mark J. Cypher wrote carefully and soaked up the citations. The archival paperwork began to tame the parlor tricks. The appeal of the myth makes sense. A man who twirls electricity like a ribbon on stage already looks like a wizard. A man who loses fortunes while inventing the motor that puts a factory's line in motion already looks like a cautionary tale about genius in a ledger-based world. A man who dreams of global wireless power while Marconi wins the first transatlantic applause already looks like the tragic hero who aimed too wide. The reality is more satisfying. He got plenty right, early and precisely. He sometimes outpromised what machines of his day could deliver. He took hits in the press and at the bank. He landed the core physics of the modern electrical age in time to light miles of boulevards in Chicago and push water power into Buffalo factories in 1896. He sketched the outlines of radio and the shape of a network that now climbs around the planet, like ivy. He spent energy on spectacle to sell principles, until the spectacle consumed the sponsorships it was supposed to fuel. The story, stripped of embellishment and still shimmering with energy, reads cleanly. In 1888, he laid out a system of alternating currents that made long-distance power transmission efficient and motors reliable. In 1891, he introduced the coil that still defines electricity in pop culture. In 1893, he turned a World's Fair into a live demonstration of axe supremacy. In 1895, 1896, he contributed to early X-ray work and watched a waterfall turn into a prototype for industrial power. In 1898, he showed radio remote control before radio had cleared its patent thicket. In 1899, he pushed voltage and resonance into landscapes and blew a generator in Colorado in the process. In 1901-1905, he built a tower to talk across oceans and tried to add power to the promise. In 1917, he accepted an award named after his former rival. In 1931, he stood on the cover of Time at 75, a living legend with a dwindling expense account. In 1943, he died in a hotel room while a world at war quietly used AC, radio, motors, and grids everywhere. The power in the wall sockets hums because of that 1888 rotating field. The neon crackle in music videos works because of the 1891 coil. The invisible signals baked into phones, routers, and satellites carry an echo from the tuned circuits that sailed through the patent office before 1900. The hydroelectric plants you can tour now are descendants of a station that spun at Niagara in 1895. The idea that machines can be steered from far away started looking normal the day a small boat in Madison Square Garden obeyed waves instead of strings. The unit named after him measures the magnetic field that makes motors turn. For all the myths and the memes, those achievements fit inside the serious steel cabinet of history. He fused calculation and showmanship, backed it with copper and iron, and then watched a century pick up his math and run with it. The footnotes, for anyone who craves them, point to places not coded in comic books. Proceedings of the I in 1880, 8 print his key lecture. The Electrical Review in the mid-1890s carries his notes on X-ray burns and apparatus. The Columbian Exposition records, and Westinghouse archives document the contracts and the wattage behind the fair's glow. The Niagara Cataract Construction Company's reports, layout, turbine counts, frequencies, voltages, and miles of line. The New York Times from 1896 to 1903 alternates between sober technical coverage and breathless marveling at arcs in the air. The Supreme Court decision in 1943 lists the patents and priorities with the legal language that scrapes spin-off of stories. W. Bernard Carlson's Tesla, Inventor of the Electrical Age, and Mark J. Cypher's Wizard, The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla, compile the paperwork into narratives that can handle both awe and receipts. He lived at a crossroads. Immigrant grit meets Gilded Age capital. Precision engineering meets show business electricity. Industrial-scale systems meet prophetic press releases. He blew fuses and minds. He turned alternating current from a frightening buzzword into infrastructure. He let lightning become the warm-up act for the motor that made the belt pulley and the elevator calm and inevitable. He kept reaching for wireless worlds and sometimes grabbed headlines instead of transmitters. People love him because the story satisfies something modern audiences recognize about ambition, timing, and how big ideas ping off capital. People remember him because light still spills from coils in museums with his name on the plaque, because rivers still spin turbines in ways he described, and because the internet that supercharges his myths also runs on ideas he nailed over a century ago. A teenage physician gets the keys to the most exclusive library in Bukhara. Weeks later, the library burns to the ground. In 10th century Transoxiana, that counts as a career origin story. In the middle stands Abu Ali al-Husayn, Ibn Abdam, Allah ibn Sina. Avicenna to the Latin West, born in 900 and dead by 1037 in Hamadan. He left behind the most influential medical encyclopedia of the medieval world and a metaphysical system that rewired how scholars thought about existence. He also left behind rumors that he torched a library, used wine as a digestive strategy, wrote complicated metaphysics during political shootouts, and taught queens, princes, and jailers that he could outthink almost anything except colic. He was the kind of prodigy that makes modern resumes look modest. By 10, he had memorized the Quran. By early teens, he had chewed through arithmetic, jurisprudence, and theology. The formal teacher assigned to him in Bukhara, Abu Abdallah al-Natili, ran out of material, which is both an accomplishment and a nightmare for a tutor. Avicenna then taught himself logic and natural philosophy from whatever he could find. He trusted books and his own head more than inherited footnotes. He made a hard pivot to medicine around age 16 because, in his own autobiographical notes preserved by his student Abu Ubaid al-Juzani, medicine felt not difficult. That line lands with the same energy as someone saying astrophysics was a casual weekend. Still, the results were real. By 18, he was recognized as a practicing physician, with people showing up for diagnoses and cures. Not long after, word reached the Samanid court. The Samanid emir in Bukhara fell ill. Avicenna treated him successfully. No flowery dialogue needed, just a real outcome recorded in early sources like Ibn al-Kifti's History of Learned Men and Juzani's biography. As a reward, he got access to the royal library, the Bibliotheca Maximum of Central Asia, full of rare texts. Scholars today still cite this as the moment he turbocharged his learning. Then the library burned. People gossiped that Avicenna incinerated his sources to cover his tracks, a suspicion he brushed off by saying he had already absorbed the contents. The historian Dimitri Gutas, who has spent decades examining those early reports, notes the rumor's persistence and its obvious dramatic appeal. Medieval clout-chasing also existed. Here comes the other greatest hits moment. From his own reminiscence, he read Aristotle's Metaphysics 40 times and understood exactly nothing beyond the table of contents. Then he bought Al-Farabi's commentary for a few dirhams, read it, and suddenly the lights came on. He credited God for the help and marked the hire of Al-Farabi's text as the intellectual unlock. The image is irresistible. A teenager in Bukhara wearing out a manuscript and then cracking it with a 3-dirham explainer. The 10th century had tutorial hacks also. The politics around him did not care about his homework. In 900, and Samanids collapsed under the pressure of the Karakhanids. Avicenna left Bukhara and headed to Urgench in Khwarazm, a magnet for scientists under the Mamunid dynasty. He overlapped with big names. Al-Biruni, the great observational polymath, lived there too. They later exchanged letters that survive, and reading them today has the energy of watching two A-list minds speedrun a physics podcast. They disputed Aristotle, vacuum, mountain formation, and the fine print of natural philosophy. Al-Biruni pushed questions from an observational angle. Avicenna often leaned on philosophical reasoning to refine the framework. One exchange over how mountains form shows Avicenna stating that layers rise and erode over time, a geologic intuition that looks surprisingly modern in spirit. Those letters survive and are cited by historians like John McGuinness to show a real debate between empirical emphasis and metaphysical scaffolding. Khwarazm grew politically hot when Mahmud of Ghazni wanted the court scholars shipped east. Avicenna avoided a forced recruitment to Ghazna and left. Around 1012 he was in Gurgen, Georgian on the Caspian, where he met Giugiani, the student who became his Boswell. There, he began writing the canon of medicine, the Kanun fil Tib, and composed a didactic medical poem, the Urjuza fil Tib, which later students memorized like a standardized test prep tool. The canon was not a quick pamphlet. It was a 5-book skyscraper of medical theory and application, with everything from basic physiology to compound drugs. He would revise it for years, but the scaffolding was up. The travel reel did not stop. He moved to Ray, near modern Tehran, around the late 1010s, joining the Bayed court of Majd al-Dawla and his formidable mother, Sayyida Shirin. The politics were messy. Avicenna practiced medicine, managed court business, and kept writing. Then he shifted to Hamadan, under Shams al-Dawla, another Bayed ruler, with a painful colic. Avicenna treated him successfully and became vizier. Imagine trying to finish a multi-volume encyclopedia while also running a province during the 11th century unrest. At one point, after court intrigues, he was dismissed, went into hiding, and, according to Giugiani, hid in the house of a greengrocer. Medieval greats did not always hide in monasteries. Sometimes they hid behind vegetables. He also got thrown into the fortress of Fardajan, near Hamadan. Prison did not slow him down. He kept writing between guards' rounds. Scholars report that parts of major works, sections of the Healing, Al-Shifa, summaries like Al-Najat, were shaped in exactly this chaos. Then, an escape from Hamadan, disguised as a Sufi. Giugiani tells it straight. He put on Sufi clothes, slipped out, and made his way to Isfahan to join Ala al-Dawla, the Kakuyid ruler. In Isfahan, he finally got a stretch of relative stability. He lectured, held scientific sessions, and finished, or polished, some of his major compositions. The Healing, despite its title, is not about medicine. It's a philosophical and scientific encyclopedia with logic, physics, mathematics, and metaphysics. He also wrote in Persian for Ala al-Dawla, producing the Danish Nama Yai, a readable philosophical handbook. The late works carry the cool, tight energy of a thinker at full power. The pointers and reminders, Al-Isharat wal Tanbihat, a distilled, sometimes spiky summary of logic, physics, metaphysics, and ethics, reads like a masterclass, with occasional barbed comments for critics. His output looks like a dare, counting conservatively, around 131 works survive out of perhaps 240 to 275 independent treatises he wrote across logic, natural sciences, mathematics, metaphysics, psychology, music, and medicine. Guterres gives the 131 count for extant works. Whole shelves in later libraries, in Arabic and Persian, trace back to this single human lifespan. He wrote sections in prose, in verse, in allegory, in handbooks, in encyclopedias. He filled nights with study, prayer, and ink. He recorded, with zero drama, a routine of sticking points in philosophy, followed by ritual prayers, after which the correct solution would sometimes appear in a dream. Modern wellness books would call that a visualization technique. He just called it help. The medicine that earned him recognition. Looks like a modern standard writer, in some places, and a Galenic world, updated with new skepticism in others. The canon's 5 books form a tight system. Book I. General medical principles. Anatomy is understood through Galeno-Aristotelian frameworks, humors and temperaments, and methods of diagnosing and testing. Book 2. Single drugs, about 760 of them, described with properties, degrees, and uses. Book 3, localized diseases by organ, from head to toe, literally. Book 5, systemic diseases, fevers, and specific pathological conditions. Surgery gets practical attention with cautions. Book 3, compound remedies, how to prepare them, their indications and contraindications. He embedded rules for testing drugs that modern historians label carefully as an early protocol for controlled pharmacological observation. The rules he lists include the requirement that a drug be tested on a simple disease, that it be free from accidental qualities, that its effect be observed at a set time and in multiple cases, and that the experiment be performed on human bodies. It is not a randomized double-blind trial, but it is a rigorous attempt to distinguish signal from noise. This is the canon, book high quality, and historians like Nancy Saraisi have long compared these passages to the birth of systematic clinical evaluation in the medieval Islamic world. He described contagious disease in terms available in his time. In the canon and in essays on hygiene, he held that certain diseases spread by contaminated air and water, and he recognized the contagiousness of phthisis, consumption, and scabies. He recommended cleanliness, ventilation, and avoidance of contact in certain conditions, mapping out a prevention landscape without modern germ theory. He kept the classic humoral backbone, but reached for evidence. He noted the sweet taste of the urine of some patients with dip-C-like conditions, understood now as diabetes, and discussed complications like gangrene. He examined pulse patterns with fine-grained attention and used pulse and urine analysis as diagnostic instruments. Within the observational constraints of his time, the analgesic and anesthetic sections get spicy. He lists opium and henbane among strong pain relievers and notes their potency and dangers. Medieval medicine did not treat opium as a vague substance. Avicenna was explicit about dosage and hazards, a point that shows up in the canon's drug chapters. He also reports recipes for soporific preparations used before procedures, mixtures that later physicians like Al-Zarawi describe in detail. With the soporific sponge, Avicenna's tone leans clinical and cautious. He knew how quickly a remedy becomes a poison, although he never saw blood circulate in a modern sense. He recorded precise anatomy of the eye and described functions of the optic nerve and lens, and he retained the Galenic belief in interventricular pores in the heart. That is a dead end, but this was pre-Harvey information architecture. He was still the guide generalizing method for drug testing, while officials around him were fighting over taxes and fortresses. He was also a psychologist in an era when the word did not exist. He divided the soul's faculties into 3 tiers: vegetative, growth; nutrition; animal, motion, sensation; and rational, intellect. He presented a fine-grained schema of internal senses: the common sense, the integrator of sensory inputs; the imaginative faculty, storing and recombining images; the estimative power, al-wam, attributing intentions to perceived forms, like seeing a wolf and grasping danger; and memory. This internal architecture shows up explicitly in Book I of the canon and in his philosophical works, and it helped medieval physicians explain dreams, illusions, and psychosomatic effects. When he discusses mental disorders, he grounds them in imbalances of faculties and humors, but also in cognitive misapprehensions, in a way that makes cognitive behavioral therapists nod in recognition across a millennium. He was, above all, a philosopher who would not let the doctors have him without a fight. His metaphysics centers on a striking distinction between essence, what something is, and existence, that it is. Contingent beings have essences that do not guarantee existence. They require causes to exist. Only one being exists necessarily, without cause. The necessary existent, al-wajib al-wujud, which is pure simplicity in unity. This is the core of his argument for God, framed with a precision that medieval Latin thinkers, like Thomas Aquinas, would later pick up and adapt. He describes the emergence of the world in an emanationist schema, where intellects proceed from the necessary existent in a sequence that culminates in the active intellect. Think of it as a cosmic mind that informs human cognition. The flint of Aristotle, the spark of Neoplatonism, and Avicenna's own logic build, a structure that scholars like John McGuinness and Dag Nicolaus Hasse map out in their overviews. Even readers hostile to him, like Al-Ghazali in The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifa, around 1095, recognized the system's coherence enough to target it, point by point. Al-Ghazali accused him of 3 doctrinal errors: asserting the eternity of the world, denying God's knowledge of particulars, and denying bodily resurrection. Those are statements of what Al-Ghazali believed Avicenna's system led to, and the controversy kept medieval theologians, like Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, and philosophers, like Averroes, very busy. Avicenna's most famous philosophical scene is a thought experiment. The floating man appears in several of his works, including the treatise on the soul, within the healing, and the pointers. Imagine a person created fully formed, floating in the air, deprived of all sensory contact, limbs splayed so they do not touch, no sight, no sound, nothing. That person would still affirm awareness of self. Therefore, self-awareness does not depend on sensing the body. Avicenna uses the scenario to argue that the rational soul is immaterial and not identical to the body. Philosophers have argued about every line of that for centuries. The scene survives without props or stagecraft because it is precise and genuinely startling. The 11th century produced a minimalist blockbuster in 1 paragraph. His logic is powerful in a way that gives even modern readers a headache and a grin. He refined syllogistic logic, invented new modalities, and developed temporal modal logic to handle statements like every A is B at time t. He analyzed induction with care and treated analogy and exception across legal and scientific contexts. He liked clean structures. He made them crisp, and he put them to work in medicine and science, folding observation into logic without letting either pretend to be alone in the room. The day job kept changing. In Hamadan, he wore the vizier's robe and the physician's robe interchangeably. He rode with Shams al-Dawla on campaigns. In Isfahan, he saw his employer, Ali al-Dawla, attacked by the Ghaznavids and dealt with the fallout. He liked music and wrote about it in the mathematical section of The Healing, classifying intervals and modes the way a theorist would classify scales today, because for medieval polymaths music belonged to mathematics. He wrote in Arabic and Persian, making sure that the Persian-speaking court in Isfahan had access to logic and metaphysics written in their language, not just imported through Arabic. One of the most reported, and frankly human, details about Avicenna is his attitude toward wine and regimen. Accounts in Dujani's biography and later sources note that he sometimes used wine for digestion and pain relief, a not unusual recommendation in the medical culture of his time, and that he overworked himself spectacularly. He would study late, eat little, sleep less, prescribe treatments during the day, lecture, then pick up the pen again at night. He wrote that, when he could not solve a problem, he would perform ritual prayers and ask for guidance. Then sometimes the insight came in sleep. He also admits to indulgence that aggravated his colic. The last phase of his life is a medical case note written across a battlefield map. In 1037, while traveling with Ala al-Dawla on campaign near Hamadan, he suffered a severe exacerbation of chronic colic that turned to dysentery. He tried to manage it with the treatments he knew, including opium for pain, but his body lost the fight. Giugiani reports that Avicenna, sensing the end, gave away his goods, freed his slaves, returned ill-gotten gains where he remembered them, recited the Quran, and died in Ramadan, 428 Ha. June 1037. At roughly age 57, he was buried in Hamadan. His modern tomb in Hamadan, an iconic mid-20th century monument designed by Hushan Sehun, draws visitors who stand in a clean geometric building to honor a man who wrote geometry and medicine with both hands. The connection writes itself. The influence of the canon of medicine turned Europe's universities into Avicenna reading clubs for centuries. Gerard of Cremona translated the canon into Latin in Toledo in the 12th century, alongside works by Al-Razi and others. Latin scholars called it the canon, with capital letters, as if medicine had blown up a constitution. The first printed Latin edition of the canon rolled off a press in 1473 in Milan, which places Avicenna at the dawn of print. In the following century and a half, countless editions appeared, and the canon became a core text in medical faculties from Bologna to Montpellier and beyond, used in lectures and commentaries well into the 1600s. For English-language readers, historians like Saraisi and Vivian Nutton, and Arabic Islamic specialists like Guterres, have tracked how the canon shaped diagnoses, therapeutics, pharmacology, and medical pedagogy far beyond Avicenna's own circles. His philosophic influence traveled along separate and overlapping roads. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars read and responded to him. Maimonides read him critically, wary in theology, but deeply engaged in medicine. Thomas Aquinas absorbed and transformed Avicenna's essence existence analysis while opposing him on the eternity of the world. Averroes spent pages correcting what he saw as Avicenna's Neoplatonic corruption of Aristotle, a feud conducted entirely in dense commentary, which was the medieval version of a YouTube comment fight, except the footnotes weighed as much as small dogs. Later, in the Safavid era, Mulla Sadra worked through an Avicennian framework to create a new metaphysical system where existence, wujud, takes precedence. A development that shows how Avicenna could provide the scaffolding, even when later thinkers radically updated the architecture. There is a roll call of moments that show him as a working doctor, not just a theoretician. The colic of Shams al-Dawla and Hamadan's politics forced him to improvise. The mother of Majd al-Dawla in Ray relied on him for diagnoses. He navigated family factionalism with a physician's patience and a bureaucrat's realism. He wrote the canon's section on fevers with clinical seriousness and insisted on observation, not just theory. He understood the social side of disease. He recommended that physicians keep patients' trust, report outcomes accurately, and avoid charlatanry. He reminded physicians to notice how temperament, diet, and season affected disease, and to adjust treatments accordingly. He described what moderns call placebo effects, in the sense that he noted the influence of belief and habit on symptoms. When he lists the functions of the estimative faculty in the soul, he sets the table for why insult, fear, hope, and grief could show up in pulse changes and digestive distress. He also loved a classification problem. He divided sciences into what the intellect needs to become complete. Logic, to train correct reasoning. Mathematics with its subfields of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Natural philosophy, to handle bodies in motion and rest. And metaphysics to study existence itself. He builds the healing as a tour through that curriculum. The effect is like watching someone rewrite the liberal arts core about 1,000 years before modern catalogue committees. A lot of the lore attached to him springs from early sources. Giugiani's autobiographical compilation carries the key events and a tone of sober admiration. Ibn al-Kifti adds details, Nizami Arudi's Makala, compiled in the 12th century, gives lively anecdotes for storytelling, like Avicenna's performance under pressure and his early genius, but collapses time for dramatic effect in places. Later biographers embroidered stories, separating solid events from later legend, is what scholars like Gutas and McGuinness do. Some stories, like Avicenna curing a patient who thought he was a cow by threatening to slaughter him, belong to this legend category. Popular retellings love it, and it teaches a real principle about suggestion and therapy. But the chain of transmission makes cautious historians hedge. The entertaining details that can be pinned to reliable sources, the library access, the prison writing, the disguise to Isfahan, the exchange with al-Biruni, are already vivid enough. The myths about his medical work tilt in both directions. He did not discover blood circulation. That was William Harvey's 1628 De Motu Cordis in Europe, built on earlier Arabic and Latin hints like Ibn al-Nafis' 13th century description of pulmonary circulation. Avicenna held the Galenic view of circulation and ventricle pause. At the same time, he is not just a transmitter of Galen. He updates texts, tests, compounds, systematizes diagnostics, and writes a well-structured, empirically respectful medical corpus. The canon is not mere summary. It is best understood as a grand synthesis with original argumentation and method. His relationship with astrology is equally nuanced. He sometimes wrote about astral influences as a culture-wide explanatory language, but he also criticized astrological determinism and refused to reduce medicine to star charts. When the physician is weighing whether a fever will break, planetary positions are not his primary instrument. Pulse and Uranus keep the star talk at the level of weather forecasts and not fate, and the Avicennian physician remains in the clinic. The letters with al-Biruni are a highlight reel for anyone who loves to watch experts disagree constructively. One letter has al-Biruni asking about the vacuum and whether a void could exist. Avicenna's Aristotelian commitments pushed him to reject a void in nature. Another exchange treats geology and mineral formation. Avicenna's remarks on mountain uplift and erosion look like someone thinking over millions of years, using the mental frameworks available in 1020. He was not doing field geology with a hammer. He was doing armchair geology with logic and reports. And yet he got key intuitions right. This is the part of his legacy that makes modern readers smile. He had both the courage of a metaphysician and the caution of a clinician, and he knew when each mode mattered. The dry humor in his life comes out under pressure. Greengrocer hiding is a real thing. He did. He wrote that a heavy workload and an indulgent regimen aggravated his health. For anyone who has tried to live on coffee and deadlines, he is a medieval caution sign. There is also the way he handles his critics. In the Pointers, he opens with serene definitions and then slides in short jabs at earlier logicians. He was done with muddle. He wanted edges. He wrote music theory and then wrote about prophetic knowledge. He weighed the limits of syllogistic logic and then spent pages classifying syllogisms. He wrote about ethics and politics, clear that a just polity depends on the right ordering of souls and institutions. He held that the happy life comes from the perfection of the rational soul and moderation of appetites, a statement that a Stoic, an Aristotelian, and a modern cognitive scientist could all read and nod at. He thought the point of medicine was to restore balance. The point of philosophy was to produce an intellect capable of grasping truth, and the point of politics was to make both possible. Even the way he arranged the canon's drug list tells a story. He categorizes by degree of potency and lists corrective substances to temper poisons. He uses case reports. He says out loud when an effect is uncertain or rare. He acknowledges regional variations and supply chains. He does not drop a miraculous universal solvent into the text and walk away. He writes as someone who knows the physician's reputation, stands on the ratio of help to harm delivered in a room where a real person sits. He is a precise writer, even in Persian. The Danishnamayi Alai reads like a short course in Aristotelian science for princes, with the philosophical good parts kept intact. He wrote allegories, short mystical narratives like the recital of the bird, that present the soul's ascent and purification in images, but even these feel like exercises in perspective rather than fantasy for its own sake. Later, Sufis loved them. Philosophers argued about their metaphysical status. A multi-tool like Avicenna attracted multiple readerships, and each found a handle. The afterlife of his medical text turned European book markets into Avicenna engines. Medical professors wrote commentaries on the canon. They argued about whether a treatment came from Galen or Avicenna, and which authority to privilege. The canon's Book 3, with its organ-by-organ approach, made exam questions practically write themselves. The canon generated entire academic genres and also gave apothecaries a manual to measure powders and decoctions. 30 or 40 reprints in the late 15th and 16th centuries is a conservative estimate. A 1593 copy in a physician's library in Padua would not have raised an eyebrow. His philosophy produced yet another wave. The essence, existence, distinction became a marquee concept in Latin scholasticism. Avicennian became a word. Universities in Paris and Oxford used Avicenna to prop up arguments in metaphysics and to sharpen logic curricula. Jewish philosophers, writing in Arabic and Hebrew, debated his emanation scheme and prophecy theory. Maimonides, in the Guide for the Perplexed, and in his medical writings, lives in a universe where Avicenna is the air intellectuals breathe, even when he refuses to inhale certain parts. Later Muslim theologians turned Avicenna into a sparring partner or a source. Fakhr al-Din al-Razi rewrites entire sections with a critical eye, sometimes defending, sometimes demolishing, always aware of Avicenna's weight. Averroes, the champion of Aristotle, scolded him for importing Neoplatonism into the peripatetic house, but the fact that Averroes devoted so much energy to correction tells you who set the table. Back to the beginning, to the Bukhara kid, who could not make sense of Aristotle until Al-Farabi's commentary cracked it. He read the commentary, thanked God, and moved on. He cured a prince, read a library, endured a rumor, survived political storms, and kept writing. He wrote the Canon of Medicine, which treated 760 single drugs and arranged conditions into fevers, organ diseases, systemic illnesses, mental disorders with precision. He wrote the Healing, a master encyclopedia. He wrote the Pointers and Reminders, a late work both sharp and compressed. He wrote in Persian and Arabic. He never stopped. The rate of production makes coffee nervous. Anyone tempted to turn him into a secular hero will run into his devotional life. He prayed when stuck. He saw solutions in sleep and thanked God. He read Aristotle through an Islamic intellectual culture that felt comfortable moving between revelation, philosophy, and medicine without panic. He wrote about prophecy as the highest perfection of human faculties. He did not see a contradiction in healing the body and tracking the rise of intellect. The broadest point alongside the best anecdotes is simple. Avicenna is not just the guy who wrote a dense medical book and a messy metaphysics. He is the guy who explained how to test a drug with care when political life was a live-action shouting match, who distinguished essence from existence while the tax collector knocked, who wrote an encyclopedia in jail, escaped dressed as a Sufi, taught in open courts, traded letters with al-Biruni, died of a condition he had studied, and left a canon that printed in Milan in 1473 and sat on desks in Europe until the 17th century. The medieval world got a doctor-philosopher with a sense for method and a taste for clarity. Later worlds inherited the habits of thought he normalized. He steps onto the modern screen as a man who believed in the intellect's capacity to know and the physician's responsibility to observe. He did not rely on vibes. He catalogued, tested, argued, and rewrote. He aimed for clean definitions and controlled trials by medieval standards. And he built a metaphysical system so carefully that critics had to invent whole literatures just to attack it properly. The wry detail is this: he did it while sleeping too little, reading too much, using wine medicinally, and upsetting princes who did not appreciate being told their bile was imbalanced. He is recognizable across time. The researcher with a day job, the clinician with a theory, the philosopher with deadlines, the human with colic who forgot to rest. His tomb in Hamadan is not just a tourist site. It is a node that connects Afshana, Bukhara, Gurganj, Ray, Hamadan, Isfahan, Toledo, Milan, Paris, and Isfahan again, a path traced by manuscriptions, translations, debates, and prescriptions. The inscriptions could read a line from his own late work. Clarity over confusion, demonstration over noise, and healing in both senses, bodies and minds. The record is strong enough to stand with names, numbers, and paper trails. Jujani's biography, Ibn al-Kifti's notices, al-Biruni's letters, the piles of manuscript catalogues, the Milkal Kotson Soissons Milan edition, the medical faculty lists from Renaissance universities, the quotations in Aquinas and Maimonides, the critiques by al-Ghazali and Averroes, the analyses by Gutas, McGuinness, Hasse, and Saraisi. The myth-making crowd shows up anyway, because myths travel faster than footnotes. Avicenna does not need them. His real life already reads like a story a producer would reject for being too packed. The appeal is not just the content, it is the temperament. Firm when stating a principle, flexible when testing a drug, confident enough to argue with Aristotle, humble enough to buy a commentary when stuck, pious enough to pray for clarity, pragmatic enough to change cities when rulers changed moods, patient enough to repeat definitions, sharp enough to build entire scaffolds that stayed up for centuries. A balanced temperament is not an accident in a humoral medicine that made balance a law. He lived his own doctrine tightly enough that the record rings true across 1,000 years. The humor writes itself again. In the greengrocer anecdote, a man who redrew the metaphysical map hides behind baskets of herbs while writing. The joke is gentle and true. Put genius into public life, and it resorts sometimes to underground tactics. He came back up, dusted himself off, and finished another chapter. The medical recipe for the situation reads like this: 1 part courage, 1 part pragmatism, 1 part endless pen. The punchline, finally, is a statistics fact and a cultural one. About 131 works survive under his name, across roughly 240 plus treatises, counting conservatively. The canon's 760 single drugs and hundreds of compound recipes show an empirical insistence that has not aged. The first printed canon in 1473 ties him to the technology that ended scribal scarcity. The metaphysical distinction of essence and existence travelled into Thomistic textbooks. The floating man test sets up modern debates about consciousness. The letters with al-Biruni capture 2 minds operating at full speed. The greengrocer, disguise, lifts his legend without breaking the facts. And the final clinical note, colic turning to dysentery in 1037, reminds every brilliant physician that bodies do not read CVs. He stands as the rare historical figure who could be introduced as a medical pioneer without suppressing the philosopher, or as a philosopher without apologizing to the doctors. That dual power is why the canon sat in lecture halls in Bologna, why the healing sits in modern scholarly editions, why the pointers still get seminars, and why a gravestone in Hamadan now carries a mid-century modern hat. Avicenna turned careful intellection into a method and a cultural habit. The medicine worked insofar as science allowed. The philosophy worked in shaping entire curricula, and the personality survived as the right kind of rumor, someone operating at a speed that forced others to keep up. There is a schedule in Giussani's notes: administrative duties by day, teaching in the afternoon, writing deep into the night, sometimes dictating to assistants. Readers today treat these as footnotes. They also read like an admission that there are costs. He paid them. He burned out his body while lighting up everyone else's library. The Samanid library burned, and he did not. And the rumor reversed the facts. He outlived his reputation by writing until his reputation could handle it. By the end, multiple worlds coexisted in one person. The boy wonder of Bukhara, the royal physician of Hamadan, the Sufi-clad escapee to Isfahan, the lecturer for Ala al-Dawla, the epistolary dualist with al-Biruni, the target of al-Ghazali, the reference for Aquinas, and the print-era staple of European med schools. Anyone compiling a list of greatest hits will leave something out. That is the kind of problem Avicenna solved by writing another treatise. The long view shows him doing exactly that across decades, turning personal endurance into public knowledge. The files are open. The dates are stable. The math checks out. No invented dialogue is needed, because the real scenes already sound like fiction. The teen who cracked Aristotle with Al-Farabi's help, the rumor-flecked library, the disease list with actual recipes and test rules, the floating man, the philosophy cage match with Al-Ghazali, the letter volley with al-Biruni, the serial aisle witness protection in Hamadan, the late life regimen that reads like a doctor, ignoring his own advice, the Milan printer in 1473 giving the canon a new life, the tomb in Hamadan anchoring the root, the philosophies of Avicenna anchor a medicine that treats bodies and a system that treats beliefs about being. He made both count with the same calm voice. He opens a medical book with the same precision. He opens a metaphysical one, and he ends a life with a simple gesture of returning goods, reciting scripture and letting the work stand. The record says it plainly, and the staying power of that record is the ultimate metric. Whole disciplines teach his content. Whole cultures debated his principles. Whole centuries printed his books. The road from Afshana to Hamadan runs straight through any serious library today. The man who walked it did so with humor, carved by circumstance, intellect tempered by prayer, and a pen that never gave up the page.